Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. Yulee, Nassau County, Florida. Home to 34-year-old mother of 3, Jolene Jensen Cummings. Described as fun and always up for something social, her friends said she was simply a kind, loyal, and caring person. She loved being a mother and called her children her proudest achievement. After giving birth to her daughter, sadly her relationship broke down, and she decided she wanted a change of scenery. Jolene started working at Tangle's hair salon in Yulee, Florida, and settled right in. The regulars loved her, and her boss Jim said she was great with clients. She could talk to anyone. She then met her husband Jason Cummings, and the pair had 2 boys. Her life was suddenly busier than ever. But in 2017, she and her husband Jason had agreed to part ways and separate, working on a custody plan together. She briefly had a relationship with a man who was also called Jason, but that too had come to an end after a string of arguments. Her friend said it was a shame. She was a great person, and sadly her relationships just weren't working out. But Jolene took everything in her stride. She was now focused on her children and career. She was looking for a fresh start and new beginnings. May 12, 2018. It was business as usual for Jolene as she headed into a fully booked day at Tangle's. She was already looking forward to clocking off at 5 p.m. and getting ready for the next day. Not only was it her birthday, it coincided with Mother's Day too. And she was ready to spend all day with her children and catch up with everyone's birthday wishes. She and her children would spend the day making a gift for her own mom and in having a real family day. The following morning, however, she was supposed to meet with her ex-husband to get their children, but she never turned up. Saturday was her busiest day. She was back to back, and maybe she just overslept. But a day later, with still no word from Jolene, and reported her missing. Her car was also missing. Her bank records showed no activity, and her phone was just going to voicemail. Her boss Jim said that Jolene loved her kids more than anything, and there wasn't a chance she would have disappeared without something being really wrong. We are all very worried. It's just so out of character for her to disappear. Her life was those children, and I refuse to believe she just took off, he said. Now friends say this is where she works right here, Tangle's hair salon, and this is where deputies say she was last seen leaving here on Saturday night around 5. Deputies say she may be driving a 2006 beige Ford Expedition with a Florida license plate number 035 KBQ. A client also tells me she got her hair done on Friday by Cummings, and she seemed fine, and she even talked about painting and crafting with her kids on Mother's Day. And I just spoke to Cummings' boss here just a couple of minutes ago, and he says they are very worried. Something is just not right. We know there's somebody out there that knows where she's at and will do the right thing and give us a call, so we can let her come home to her family. Down the street, neighbors like Lexi are also on the lookout for the young mother. We're all close-knit, small town, so if something happens you hear about it as soon as it happens. The first 2 people they wanted to speak to were her ex-husband Jason C. and her on-off boyfriend Jason G. Jason C. was very worried and cooperative, and he came down to the station right away. He said even if things had been testing for them as they navigated this split, his family was his priority, and he respected her a lot. I wasn't very old, and that's my kid's motto. That's what I do take seriously. He had concerns about Jason G., calling him a junkie, and saying he had heard bad things about the company he kept. He told police they could search whatever they wanted, his house, his phone, his car. He had absolutely nothing to hide. With a strong alibi and a look around his place, they were confident he was not involved. When it came to locating Jason G., however, this was more difficult. One of Jolene's neighbors said that on May 9th, just 3 days before she went missing, she had heard things smashing and Jolene shouting at her kids to shut the bedroom door. Alarm bells had gone off and she called the police, but once Jason G. heard the officers coming, he bolted. This was a big lead, and they realized he was actually wanted on an outstanding warrant anyway. Finally, deputies found Jason G. hiding under some cardboard boxes inside a house, and he was arrested for probation violations. He admitted they were involved in an argument after he showed up uninvited asking to stay. When she told him no, he got aggressive and started slamming things. Police commented on the scratches and marks on his arm, but he said they had come from playing with his dog. He said he would let them search what they wanted, and he would take a polygraph as well. However, He had now lost his phone and couldn't tell them where he'd been over the last few days, and therefore could not give them an alibi. When police pointed out how this all looked to them, he said he wanted a lawyer. He was named as a person of interest in her disappearance. Just a couple of hours earlier, deputies arrested Cummings' ex-boyfriend, Jason G., who had a warrant out for a probation violation. But deputies say he is not talking. Investigators say he was found near a wooded area in Hilliard, where deputies were searching Monday night after receiving a tip. They say G and several others are persons of interest in the disappearance. Frustratingly, tips were few and far between, with only a few coming in, and none that led to anything. There were just so many gaps in this story. But on May 16th, investigators got their first break when they found Jolene's Ford SUV parked in a Home Depot parking lot about 2 miles away from her salon. Security footage from the area showed it being parked up at 1:15 a.m., several hours after Jolene would have finished her shift. Once the car was parked up, a figure dressed all in black ran away. After following the shadowy figure from camera to camera, they finally got a very clear image. A woman in all black had walked into a gas station a few minutes later, where she asked to borrow a phone to call for a cab. She only stayed for a few minutes before leaving. It was obvious that she had been driving Jolene's car, so why park it up and leave if the intent was to steal it? The person that served her that night told the detectives it was one of the strangest conversations he'd ever had. She had spent a lot of time talking about what meth does to your body and sharing details about her night drinking with people. She talked and talked before jumping into her cab. "Can we sit down for a second? There was a female that came into the store the other night, right here?" "Yes." "And y'all sat there and talked for a little bit?" "Yes, she had me call her a taxi." "She had you call her a taxi?" "Yeah." "Can you tell me what your conversation was with her?" "She said something about how she was out with a couple of friends drinking, and one of the friends' ex-boyfriends came around. There had been some kind of problem. She didn't go into detail for it much after that. And, to be honest, I don't even know how she got to the store because she had me call her a taxi. And then 10 to 15 minutes later, she was gone. The taxi came and picked her up and took her. She said somewhere to a Plant Fitness that was around us. She went into this really weird conversation about what meth does to your body. Literally, this is what most of our conversation was about. What meth does to your body. It was really weird. While investigators continued to look into these cameras, a thorough look over the salon painted a very bleak picture. There were huge pools of blood everywhere, and even though there had been an attempt to clean it up, there was no hiding this from the luminol. There was no other conclusion they could draw. Jolene was now dead, and she had been killed in this salon. They were now happy to rule out Jason G. as well, and a random break-in because it just didn't make any sense. The manager of the salon, Jim, showed the police the work schedule, and the last person to have been working with Jolene was another stylist called Jennifer Sibbert. When investigators arrived to speak with Jennifer, she wasn't there, despite being set to open that day. Jim called Jennifer just as she was pulling into the parking lot. She took one look at the police and drove back out. She then told Jim she was quitting. They'd never see her again, and she wanted her final paycheck. Detectives showed everyone in the salon the CCTV footage from the gas station, and without missing a beat they said absolutely it was Jennifer, except she did have different hair. Jim gave them her address, but the address didn't even exist, and they had no idea where Jennifer now was. She was returning no phone calls, was the last person to see Jolene, was giving out fake addresses, and had been seen parking Jolene's car. Jennifer Sibbert had only been at the salon for just over a month, and kept to herself by all accounts. She was new to the area, and no one really knew anything about her. Jennifer, for some reason, definitely didn't like Jolene. One client said that as Jolene was washing her hair, Jennifer inserted herself into their conversation and was incredibly nasty to her for no reason. Other colleagues saw this bully-like behavior a lot, and it seemed the new girl was bothering everyone. One of Jolene's colleagues called Jennifer crazy and said she put everyone on edge. Her behavior and constantly changing appearances made her mind go to weird places. "I felt like she killed somebody and she's on the run," she said. Put simply, this was a small-town, family-oriented salon, and Jennifer did not fit in. Nor did she want to. A former boss said she was definitely over the top with a lot of quirks. She once ate a pound of beef using her bare hands and ended up storming out, never to return, all over some sliced lemons. Before she was at Tangle's, she worked at another salon, and co-workers there said they too often felt uncomfortable working with her. She was paranoid, had severe mood swings, and they knew she got the job using false information which unnerved everyone. And just a couple of days before she went missing, Jolene had been overheard saying to Jennifer, "Go away, I don't like you, you're crazy, you're fake." Jolene sent another friend a text about Jennifer saying, after placing a bolo, or be on the lookout for Jennifer's car, they finally tracked her down. She was miles away, sleeping rough in her car in a gas station. She had injuries to her face and body that looked consistent with being in a fight. They were able to arrest her on an auto theft charge, but there was more to it. Everyone's eyes were on Jennifer Seibert, except they realized they weren't talking to Jennifer Seibert. They were actually talking to Kimberly Kessler, and she had been reported missing herself back in 2004 in Butler County by her mother. When you run my fingerprints through, they come up as Kimberly Lee Kessler. I was born in May of 1968, May 9th. I'm 50 years old. I've been living under this particular alias since 1999. So not quite 1999, this is about 19 years. So I would prefer to be called Kim. She was very self-assured, bordering on arrogant, loved to talk about herself, and had an answer for everything. Okay, I just want to make sure that I've called you by your right name. But if you run that through, the last time I got picked up was back in 1999, and I bonded out. And it took them, I don't remember, it was a couple of weeks. I don't know if it was 2.5 weeks or 3.5 weeks before they actually, matched them up. Yeah, it didn't but that was 1999, so maybe it was a little bit slower then. But I don't know, there's lots of people on the face of the planet, so maybe it still takes time. They asked her why she had left town and changed her name, and Kimberly said it was to stop her ex from finding her. She had settled on the name Jennifer Seibert after reading it on a tombstone. Jennifer was actually a little girl that had been killed in a car accident. As odd as this story already was, this was far from her only name change. Kimberly Kessler actually had 25 different aliases, 5 driver's licenses across 33 cities and 14 states alongside fake social security numbers. She would drastically change her appearance too, wearing different wigs and cutting and dyeing her hair, before moving away and starting somewhere new. Just go through when you work with her on that Saturday, so I can... Is there anything you can tell me? Did she ever talk to you about a boyfriend? I know she's got a husband. I know she had a boyfriend. Did she ever talk about anybody she was scared of? Did she ever say anything that she wanted to run away and get away from it all? I don't remember hearing anything. She would have different conversations sometimes with different clients. She was saying CPS came to her house. She was telling one client that I caught a little blip of it in between listening to YouTube and the phone ringing. And I remember hearing her say she thought her ex-husband or her husband was doing it to get out of paying child support. That's all I heard. And I don't remember ever hearing about a boyfriend ever. But then again, I don't always really pay attention. Did she tell you who she was hanging around with? Or was she saying anything that maybe she shouldn't have been? She would just say to me the time or two that she'd say, "I'm just going home and having a quiet night at home." Or "I don't have the kids tonight," or, whatever. "I'm just going to enjoy this." She said she had no idea where Jolene could be and didn't even admit to stealing her car, despite the cameras showing she quite clearly did. At one point, she randomly accused Jolene of being a meth addict, something which everyone said was absolutely ridiculous. But I did find a bag that I believe had crystal meth in it, just a little bit in the bottom, a tiny baggy bag by the back door. Did you guys ever hang out after work? Did you ever go anywhere together? There's video of you dropping her car off at the Home Depot parking lot there in Yulee, and walking across, and going into the gate station, and getting a taxi cab back down to. They had it listed as Dick's Wings. But it was back down there to where Tangles is, okay? And that's why you're charged with a grand theft auto. And I'm not trying to trick you. I'm not trying to fool you. You're opening up to me, and I'm opening up to you, okay? That's the reason you're charged with that. You're not charged with anything else, okay? But something happened to Jolene. But just as they thought they might be getting somewhere, as soon as they turned the pressure up, Kimberly wanted a lawyer. Something that you didn't plan happened. But let me tell you what you did, okay? Because I just want to be honest with you, because I think something bad happened that you didn't intend to happen. But I don't think you're an evil person. I don't think you're a mean person. I think you have done a hell of a job getting through the last 25 years. So let me reply this way, and you may not like the answer. I would like legal counsel. But this was not a problem for the police, as more CCTV was starting to fill in the gaps. Near the bins around the back of the salon, she was seen throwing bags in on the day Jolene vanished. They wanted to find out exactly where the trucks had taken the bins once they had been emptied. and it led them to a huge landfill with almost 4 million pounds of trash. Their hearts sank. This was simply going to be an impossible task. In the trees near the bins, they found the lid to a large plastic container, and when they finally got Kimberly's real address and a storage unit that she had recently rented, they were shocked at just how much they had found. Many items were covered in blood. A quick turnaround showed the DNA was a match to Jolene. And inside the rest of the container, they found Jolene's fingernail. A bag was also discovered with scissors in them, with yet more blood. Testing had now confirmed that some of the blood in the salon was a match to Kimberly, as well as Jolene. They believed that the scissors were the murder weapon. More searches on Kimberly's iPhone showed that she had taken pictures of a notebook where she had written pages and pages of names. One of the names was as old as an ex-boyfriend from school. Some of them had Satan, which an evil written next to them. Kimberly would often write down her dreams and talk about demons, Jesus, and stalkers. Searches on her computer were for nobody, no crime, female serial killers, and Jolene's name a handful of times. Her house had turned up 6 different wigs and several other phones. Speaking to more people that knew her various identities painted a picture of a violent and frightening woman. An ex-boyfriend said that she had matter-of-factly told him she shot her own cat with a shotgun, and as a child she had threatened to kill someone's brother with a baseball bat when he was sleeping. As strong as this case was looking against Kimberly, they still didn't know where Jolene's body was. Some more cameras from inside the Walmart would give them an idea. Footage showed Kimberly buying $30 worth of supplies including ammonia, zip ties, and an electric knife. This was at around 9 p.m., about 4 hours after Jolene would have finished her shift, and after they believed she had been killed. Kimberly then drove back to the salon, and at 11 p.m., she was spotted throwing some very heavy bags into the bin. The police said that given the amount of blood in the salon and the electric knife, they could only assume that Kimberly had dismembered Jolene and put her body into bags. On May 22nd, a news conference was held where police confirmed that while they were still looking for Jolene, they knew she would not be coming home alive. In addition to following up on all leads and evidence we were receiving, this individual was known as Jennifer Seibert. We have subsequently found out that Seibert's real name is Kimberly Kessler. Through our investigation, we have obtained evidence which we are not releasing at this time, which leads us to believe Jolene is not alive. Kessler is a suspect in the disappearance of Jolene Cummings. Sunday was a special day, not only for Mother's Day, but it was her birthday. She was born on Mother's Day. God gave me this special blessing after my firstborn infant son, Richard, was buried. I beg you as a mother to please keep coming forward, no matter how small. My 3 grandchildren, who miss her so much, we want closure. They now felt that Kimberly had been planning to kill Jolene for a few days. Given her search history, and the fact that the day Jolene was last seen coincided with the salon being shut for 2 days, police was sure she had planned it to give her time to clean up and figure out her plan. Kimberly Kessler was charged with first-degree murder, and even as she sat with handcuffs on her, she was chatting and joking, as if she was talking to friends. From jail, she would often talk to reporters and her mother. She was still denying it all, and it seemed she couldn't care less about being in a jail cell. My ability, I'll answer it. I just got interrupted on the phone with a little message that they're going to disconnect the call again. It's kind of funny. They keep me in solitary confinement like it's a bad thing. It's heaven, girl. I love it. Tom Thompson told me today that like I was the front page of the newspaper, I'm all over the news. I guess I'm still like the talk of the town or something. Why would that be starting up again? Is absolutely nothing going on in the world. I say it's because it's the Illuminati. I think that her people definitely are fucking seriously involved in it. So that's just what is happening. So I got the Illuminati on my ass. Again, I can't prove it. It's just my opinion, and what little bit I've seen on YouTube about some of the research I was doing on these secret societies is like nobody gets even 5 minutes worth or 5 seconds worth of airtime. Unless they have some sort of connection. So her stepdad, I don't know what's going on with him. If he's still in the hospital, or what's up. But I mean, normally to attain a position like he was running the jail, like you gotta be like usually like a mason or whatever. I mean, you gotta be in a secret society to hold like. I'm sure he is. If he's running a jail, I'm sure he is. They don't have anything on me because it's all bullshit. Somebody's just trying to collect. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. They're trying to collect on an insurance policy. Is what they're trying to do. And they have to have like the insurance company is not going to fucking just pay them. They didn't. They didn't. They tried to set me up, But they didn't set me up that good, obviously, because the insurance company they have to go to all this trouble to try to make me look bad. But I don't know what happened. All I know is that I didn't do anything. I had nothing to do with it. I have no idea what they're doing. I think they just look for excuses to rob and steal because they just do all kinds of shit. They took the clothes I was wearing off my back and my shoes and stole them. My rings and my jewelry. I only had 2 rings and 1 bracelet. Gone. Fucking gone. It was in my bag that they say they confiscated as evidence, but they didn't list it. And so someone pocketed that. They just use excuses to steal. I don't even know if my motorcycle is even in my storage unit. I don't know if any of my shit that's worth any value is in there. I have no idea because they're thieves. She entered a plea of not guilty. And as the weeks went on and the state built their case, Kimberly's behavior became more erratic, irrational, and unpredictable. It's fine. Why don't you just put me back in my cell? I want to get rid of the public defender's office. Yeah, exactly. Jordan Beard is Johnson's nephew. Jordan Beard is Jolie's cousin. Jail officers said that she would regularly strip naked, spread feces on the window of her cell, and once had to be stopped with pepper spray. After going on hunger strike for fear people were going to poison her. Her weight had dropped from 196 pounds to just 74 pounds. After declaring her mentally incompetent to go to trial, the judge later said Kimberly was capable of understanding the case against her. The sheriff said she was playing crazy, and she was acting crazy. She always thought that she was the smartest person in the room, and she knew exactly what she was doing. A psychiatric nurse said her behavior was well thought out and clever, but just not quite enough for people in the know. And first at 5 tonight, a high-profile murder suspect is competent to stand trial. That's according to doctors at a Florida hospital. The ruling comes to the relief of those that knew Jolie. 3 months later, it was eventually determined that Kimberly would stand trial. And to no one's surprise, it would be far from smooth sailing. The now 53-year-old had refused to participate in any proceedings and frequently created disruptions in the court. She wouldn't even cooperate with her own lawyers anymore. I refuse it. I have refused it. I refuse the public defender's office. They appointed Jordan Beard, Jolie's cousin, as my public defender. They appointed Jolie's cousin as my public defender. What? You don't want the public to know that. You don't want them to know. Here she is in the courtroom. She'll be downstairs as she's been through the proceedings thus far. But this was about justice for Jolie, and the judge would not tolerate this behavior. Everything carried on, and Kimberly would spend most of the trial in a separate room, watching via a video link. The prosecution had a few theories about why this had all happened, one of which was that Jolie didn't trust who she thought was Jennifer. She was onto her and knew something was up. She had already challenged her by calling her fake, and it looked like Kimberly's years of running were starting to catch up with her, and she couldn't risk being exposed. Another theory was that Kimberly was also very jealous of Jolie, jealous of her life, jealous of how much her clients loved her, and she just wanted her gone. Her public defender said that yes, it was clear there had been a fight. He was not disputing that, but to get a first-degree murder conviction there needed to be proof of premeditation, and he said that the state simply could not prove that, and there was still nobody to prove a time of death or cause. I am a lawyer for Kimberly Kessler, aka Jennifer Marie Steyer, and we're here to count 1 first-degree murder. We, the jury, found the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, as charged in that indictment. The jury found Kimberly Kessler guilty of first-degree murder and grand theft auto. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Kimberly was transferred to another jail, much to the relief of the people who had been dealing with her. She's evil. She's evil in the flesh. I want her behind out of our jail, because we are fed up with her crap. It's the state's problem from now on. I don't for 1 second believe that Kimberly Kessler, or whatever name she's going by today, I don't believe this is her first murder. We're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate her home going, because it's her new home for the rest of her life until she takes her last breath. So I've been assured she'll be on the first bus tomorrow out of town, and when she leaves, we're going to have cake and ice cream. If you could find it within your heart to tell us where the remains of my daughter, where are the remains of my daughter? Give us some closure. I'm asking you from one mother to another. Tonight marks 411 days since Jolene Cummings was last seen in Nassau County. Jolene's remains have never been found, and sadly it seems unlikely that they ever will be. After being open 10 years, Tangle's Hair Salon closed its doors permanently after the company that held the lease refused to work with them anymore. But the owner and colleagues said that so much had happened that carrying on without Jolene felt too sad anyway. It would not be the same. It's too heartbreaking without Jolene at this point anyway, said the business via statement on Facebook. Jolene's daughter now lives with her grandmother, and Jolene's sons are with her ex-husband Jason. In a recorded interview, Jason said he fell in love with her because she was such a good mother to her daughter. She taught him how to be a great dad, and he makes sure their sons talk about her all the time. If you could say one more thing to Jolene, what would it be? The interviewer asked. I don't even think you'll have enough film in that camera, Jason smiled and said. The world no longer feels as safe as it once did. When your child is murdered, grief is only the beginning. But she still feels her daughter talking to her and guiding her. The children are surrounded by Jolene's pictures. While I know Jolene's soul is in heaven, I feel her spirit is here, watching over her children. Sometimes I hear her say, Mom, do this or do that. Kiss and hug the kids for me. It brings a smile to my face and tears to my eyes. Story 2. The 22nd of December, 1978. Shakti, Russia. As she waited for a ride home, Svetlana Gurenkova noticed a young girl in a red coat stood not far from her. Standing beside her was a tall, middle-aged man with large glasses, a long black coat, and a shopping bag in his hand. Whilst his appearance was nothing remarkable, what caught Svetlana's eye was the fact he was whispering to the young girl and staring at her. It didn't look like they were relatives or knew one another. However, he walked away, and soon after the young girl went too. Svetlana watched as they walked off, and her streetcar arrived. That was the last she saw of them. The following day, the body of a little girl was found in the Groshevka River, and as the news spread, Svetlana went to the police to tell them what she had seen the day before. 9-year-old Yelena Zakitnova had been on her way home from school. That day she had told a friend that she had met a nice old man who would be able to get her imported chewing gum. She had walked with the man to a rundown house, a place he called his secret house. He opened the door and let them both inside before locking the door behind them. Yelena was trapped with a monster and unable to escape. He quickly overpowered her and removed her coat and underwear. She had tried to scream for help, but he stifled her screams with his arm on her neck, and he used the weight of his body to crush her. She eventually stopped moving. He used her scarf to blindfold her as her eyes were still open, before brutally sexually assaulting her. She began to stir and tried to struggle for breath. The man pulled out a large knife and stabbed her 3 times in the abdomen. He then picked up her body and his things and walked across the road to the Groshevka River. He put her body and bag into the icy water and watched as she floated downstream and out of sight. He didn't realize that he hadn't turned the light in the house off, or that Yelena's blood had dripped onto the doorstep. 2 days later, her little body was found. The police brought in a sketch artist, and Svetlana gave them a description. A middle-aged, tall, thin man with glasses. That evening, a local man, Alexander Kravchenko, was arrested. He wasn't middle-aged, he was 25, and he didn't wear glasses. He had just served 6 years of a 10-year sentence for the rape and murder of a 17-year-old girl. While he was being interrogated, the police circulated the sketch of the person Svetlana had seen, and one person they showed it to was the principal of a local mining school. He thought he recognized it as being one of his members of staff that taught there, a man called Andrei. The police told him not to tell anyone about it. The search for information found out along the river, and 2 officers began to look at the houses across the road, and it was here they found their first clue. Blood on the steps of a small, rundown house, a house that still had the light on. They spoke to the neighbors, and they confirmed the owner of the house was a man called Andrei. Andrei was brought in for questioning, but was very soon let go after his wife had provided him with an alibi. She confirmed that he had been at home with her the whole evening. With that lead seemingly going nowhere, they turned their attention back to Kravchenko. After more questioning, he confessed to killing the little girl. He was tried and found guilty and given 15 years in a labor camp, but for the locals this sentence was not enough, and they lodged a complaint. A new judge agreed with the public. Alexander Kravchenko was subsequently sentenced to death and executed in the 1980s. For the police, this was another case solved. Unbeknownst to them, not only had they executed the wrong man, but the real killer had slipped away from right under their noses. By the time of Kravchenko's execution, the real killer had murdered more women and children, and he was on a path of brutality and destruction, the horrors of which many would scarcely be able to believe. Today's case takes us to somewhere we have not been before on Trudy Criminal, the Soviet Union. It's always important when looking at criminal cases to examine the wider context and the socio-political backdrop upon which it sits. And this is precisely what makes this particular case so interesting and also so challenging. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was just a decade away from collapse. The regime that had overthrown the ruling Romanov family and hundreds of years of Tsarist rule pushed Hitler and the Nazi forces back, and won the Battle of Berlin was falling apart at the seams. Decades of repression, purges, and famine had blighted its most recent history, and it is against this backdrop that our case begins in the city of Rostov-on-Don, located around 600 miles south of Moscow, and at the time home to 1.4 million people. For reasons that nobody has been able to fully understand, Rostov-on-Don has been home to a disproportionately high number of killers and violent offenders. From 1989 to 1999, 29 multiple murderers and sex offenders were caught, a figure reported in the Moscow Times that made Rostov the serial killer capital of the world. For 12 years, a monster had been stalking the streets of Rostov and beyond, beginning his killing spree in 1978 with Yelena Zaktanova. 3 years later, he would strike again. The 3rd of September, 1981. Larissa Kachenko had run away from boarding school. The 17-year-old was sat at the bus stop outside the Rostov Public Library. She had previously partaken in sex acts in exchange for food, and when a man promised her the same thing, she agreed to go with him. After walking into the woods, he suddenly attacked her and began to tear off her clothes. She attempted to fight back and scream, but he repeatedly punched her in the head, filled her mouth with mud, and then proceeded to strangle her. He mutilated her body, gouged her eyes out, and bit one of her nipples off. He then danced around her body, euphoric about what he had just done, before covering her with leaves and hiding her clothes. The following day, 17-year-old Larissa's body was discovered. June 1982. 13-year-old Leo Babriak had got off the bus, unaware she was being followed. She was abducted and stabbed repeatedly. She was also sexually assaulted, and her eyes were mutilated. It would be 2 weeks before her body was found, and due to the brutal summer heat, all that would remain was a skeleton. The killer would strike again in July, killing 14-year-old Lyubov Volobyeva, twice in August when he killed 9-year-old Oleg Pazyutyev and 16-year-old Olga Kaprina 3 days apart. 2 victims were killed in September, Irina Karabelnikova and Sergei Kuzmin. The final victim of that year was Olga Stamikhanok, who was killed in December. The male victims confused the police, and they believed that this was the work of 2 different killers, but the cases would soon go nowhere. September 1983. Frustrated with the lack of progress, Moscow sent Major Mikhail Fedosov and his team to lead the investigation. Not long after arriving, Fedosov would send a report back to Moscow, and it was withering. The local police were incompetent and unable to deal with the situation, which was obviously the work of one brutal and sadistic killer, dubbed the Forest Strip Killer, who was targeting the vulnerable. What wasn't used, however, was the term serial killer. Any case of a serial killer presents a unique and huge set of challenges. Trying to work out a pattern of offending, generating a profile of the killer, seeing if there was anything that linked the victims. But trying to catch a killer in the Soviet Union was a completely different ballgame. Serial killers in the USSR were pretty much unheard of due to a variety of reasons. Information was concealed, and there was a degree of refusal to believe that something like this could happen, in a bid to maintain the illusion of public order and everything being okay. A serial killer to them was a Western phenomenon, not something that happened in the Soviet Union. Fedosov requested the help of Viktor Burakov, a highly experienced specialist forensic analyst, to take charge of the investigation in Shakhty. The focus of the investigation became looking at those with mental health problems or sexual offenses in their criminal history. Despite this new focus, there were new problems. The police used extreme methods of interrogation that often resulted in false confessions. There was a mountain of evidence that continued to stack up, and this led the police to be sure that, based on semen samples taken from the scene, the killer had type AB blood. They also found gray hairs from various crime scenes that were identical. A special task force was put together by Fedosov and his deputy Vladimir Kalyasnikov. The squad would focus their attention on Rostov, especially Shakhty, and they would be led by Burakov, who was considered to be one of the best crime scene investigators in the department. With a move to a new office, the Division of Especially Serious Crimes was up and running. Operation Forest Strip had launched. The killer had a pattern. He appeared to target women and children after meeting them at bus stops or train stations. After gaining their trust, he would lure them into nearby woods, where a terrifying attack would take place. The level of brutality was shocking. Victims had their internal organs removed, genitals mutilated, tongues cut out, nipples bitten off, eyes gouged out, and some were decapitated. He also appeared to cannibalize some of his victims. The appalling acts that had been committed against the bodies after death led investigators to believe that maybe these crimes had been carried out by gangs collecting organs, or possibly even Satanists. The authorities began to scour the records of psychiatric hospitals to try and find someone with a similar pattern of behavior or with a history of sex offenses that were similar. Any person that aroused suspicion was pulled in for questioning, and samples of blood were taken to compare with the semen samples found at the scenes. A suspect by the name of Shabarov was picked up after he was spotted acting suspiciously near the streetcar depot. Shabarov had learning difficulties and told the officers that he had stolen a car with 4 men. He said that he and the 4 others had killed several children. The 5 in total were arrested and intensely questioned over the next 24 hours. They had met at a school for children with additional learning needs and quickly confessed to several of the 4 strip killings. In spite of the confession, there was one glaringly obvious problem. They couldn't say where they'd taken place. They couldn't say how many they'd committed. They couldn't even say who the victims were. And as the months passed, the men remained in custody, but the murders continued to happen. Instead of thinking they'd got the wrong men, they believed they were part of a wider criminal gang, and more men with learning difficulties were brought in. The questioning these vulnerable men were subjected to was nothing short of brutal. One of them would end up taking his own life while in custody. As the murders continued, it showed the police the truth they could no longer ignore. They had got it wrong. They were all released. The attention was then turned towards the gay community in Rostov, and they were subject to horrible and discriminatory treatment. As the authorities now believed the killer was a gay man, but this yielded no leads. The police changed focus and then began to look at people who drove for a living, as the killer was able to cover a huge area in a short amount of time. They interviewed those who held a driving license, more than 150,000 people, and despite the enormous amount of manpower being put into this new theory, it too would go nowhere. With multiple murders and multiple crime scenes, there were so many complexities, and the Soviet system certainly didn't seem to make it easier. Author Robert Cullen, who worked as a correspondent in Moscow for Newsweek and later for The New Yorker, who would also write a book about the case, would later say, like so many other branches of the Soviet system, law enforcement had overlapping bureaucracies. The militia, city police, patrolled the streets and have the responsibility for apprehending the criminals. The procurators, the federal police, had the responsibility for supervising cases and questioning suspects. On paper, the division of labor looked neat enough. In practice, it was blurred. There were lots of opportunities for the 2 agencies to get in each other's way. In an article by The Observer from 1997, it stated that there was a chronic rivalry between the police and the investigators from the prosecutor's department, which blights difficult cases. There were hundreds involved in the case, and the card index of suspects would reach roughly 15,000 people. The impact this was having on the police force and the wider community was enormous. One policeman, who was part of the investigation, mentally suffered to such an extent after being exposed to these gruesome killings. He began to hallucinate that the killer was him, and he was murdering in a trance-like state. Another officer would talk of the extreme paranoia he experienced for more than 10 years, not knowing if he was walking past the killer or sat next to him on the bus. Due to decomposition, mutilation, and disfigurement, trying to identify some of the victims was an extremely difficult challenge. So in August of 1984, the police enlisted the help of an artist to draw sketches of what the victims could have looked like. He drew one of an unidentified female, later revealed to be Lyudmila Alexeyeva. On the 28th of August, 1984, 11-year-old Alexander Chappell had been with a friend at a cinema in Rostov. After saying their goodbyes, his friend headed home on the tram, and Alexander waited for his to arrive. His body was found later by a man cutting hay on the banks of the river. September 1984. The police were now years into the investigation, and what did they know? Very little. He was type AB, but so too were many others, so this hardly helped them narrow down the pool to look at, and the killer was not stopping. There had been 11 murders over that summer, but they were still no closer to catching him. As the investigation expanded and the manhunt continued, Nearly 200,000 people would be blood tested, and tens of thousands of ex-convicts would be endlessly interrogated. Burikov knew the situation was becoming desperate, and what they had been doing thus far clearly had not been working, so he decided to take a different route. He approached the Rostov Medical Institute's sexual pathologists and psychologists to help him. They needed to create a profile of the killer. Who is he likely to be? Due to the lack of information, many of them refused to work with the police. But luckily one agreed, Dr. Alexander Buchanovsky. This was an unusual decision, as it went outside the guidelines for the Soviet police. The USSR had thus far refused to acknowledge the existence of psychopathic tendencies or sexual deviancy. This meant that Buchanovsky needed to invent a new methodology to identify the sexual pathologies of this sadistic killer they were hunting. There wasn't much information from the police to work with. They knew that he was probably between 25 and 50 years old, wore size 10 shoes, and was roughly 5'10". 10 days after being brought on board, Buchanovsky would generate a report that described the man they were looking for as being between 45 and 50 years old. He would be someone that gained sexual satisfaction from death and suffering, a necrocydist. Buchanovsky said that the killer would likely be someone who had a history of sexual problems, and that was why he had enacted such extreme violence on his victims. That was the only way he could become aroused. The killer was likely impotent and probably with extremely low self-esteem. He would be an educated man, but one with a history of sexual deviancy and someone unable to make and maintain friendships. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Police presence was upped at transport links and stations, especially the Rostov bus station, as the last two victims had disappeared from there. One of those tasked with these patrols was Inspector Alexander Zanisovsky. He stuck to what he knew. The killer always goes back to where he has had success before. He sat at the bus station and would observe until his eyes began to sting and hurt. Within a few days of patrol, he noticed something. A middle-aged man with glasses walking around. He was obviously interested in the young girls at the station. Zanisovsky continued to watch him before going up to him and asking him to identify himself. The man was nervous. He said he used to be a teacher and was just bored. That was why he was talking to the young girls. As Zanisovsky went over his paperwork, he could finally put a name to the face. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. He said he was coming home from a business trip, nothing more than that. As Zanisovsky looked over the paperwork, it revealed he worked freelance for a KGB division, the Department of Internal Affairs. With nothing really to hold him for, his papers were returned to him and he was sent on his way. But Zanisovsky had a bad feeling about the man he had just spoken to. As the patrols continued, Zanisovsky was back out with another investigator. Just as their time on duty was ending, Zanisovsky saw him. The same man from a few weeks before, wearing a black fur hat. Andrei Chikatilo. When I felt it in my guts was when I saw him the second time weeks later, doing the same thing, and I thought, you won't get away from me. He and his colleague kept their eye on him and watched him from behind a newspaper. As he got onto a bus, so did they. They followed him all day and observed him getting on and off buses around town, before heading back to Rostov station. Throughout the day, he had tried to talk to several women and girls who would ignore him, so he would turn his attention to someone else. He sat down in a chair and slept for a couple of hours, and he had no idea that the officers were watching him. He woke up and began talking to a young woman, putting his arm around her. She appeared to be under the influence as he put his hand under her shirt to touch her, which she didn't react to. But just a few minutes later, she was seen talking sternly to him before getting up and walking away. Zanisovsky made his move and stopped him. They told him they had been following him all day. They had watched as he had spoken to and pursued women relentlessly. He was not free to leave. He was under arrest. Suddenly, he was nervous and clearly on edge. Drops of sweat the size of raindrops appeared on his forehead. I had never seen that before, Zanisovsky said. What was in his briefcase? Zanisovsky asked him. A knife, Vaseline, and rope. Usually the authorities were only allowed to hold a citizen for 72 hours, but this was nowhere near enough time. The decision was made to charge him with harassing women in public places. This was a minor charge and only meant 15 days in custody, but it was better than nothing and gave them time to look into him more. When they checked his files, they realized he was under investigation for theft of supplies from work. The theft of state property was a serious offense, especially for a member of the Communist Party, which he was, and it meant that he could be kept in custody for several months. This added time also gave the authorities an opportunity to do a more thorough background check, and it revealed some very disturbing information. Cicatillo had a sexual interest in children, and the further they dug, the worse it got. He had previously worked as a teacher, but he was unable to control his classes, and both students and other teachers considered him extremely strange. There were a series of complaints made about him regarding inappropriate sexual behavior and assaults on children at school. He was kicked out of one school in 1974 and then drifted through various educational settings. At one of them, he was in charge of controlling a boys' dorm, but they had no respect for him and ridiculed him endlessly. After a few months, he was caught trying to sexually assault a boy as he slept. Senior students attacked him for this, and he ended up carrying a knife around school. He was not reported to the authorities, with one report saying this was likely because a report of this nature would reflect badly on the faculty as a whole. The picture was becoming clearer, and the evidence was certainly intriguing. The allegations of voyeurism by students, the assault on the boy in the dorm, allegedly stalking train corridors, owning a deserted house down by the river. This was painting a very damning picture. But just as their hopes were building that they had finally caught their killer, it would all come crashing down around them. When they took a sample of his blood, it was type A. The semen samples of the killer were type AB. The news was crushing. Due to the several outstanding offenses, he was sentenced to a year, but only served 3 months. He was expelled from the Communist Party upon his release. When he was set free, the police had no idea they had just let their killer go, and he was now free to kill again. But why didn't the DNA from his blood match the DNA from the semen samples? It was later determined that his blood was type A, and his semen was type AB, due to him being a non-secreta, meaning his blood type could not be inferred by anything other than a blood sample. If they had taken samples of hair, saliva, or semen, they would have had the AB match they needed. Although the Soviet authorities later argued that this was what had happened, one of the leading forensic experts, Edward Blake, theorized that there was simply not enough care when dealing with the samples in the first place. For Zanisovsky, this was not the end. He was sure Cicatillo was the man they were looking for. It all seemed to fit together, but his superiors disagreed. Zanisovsky was demoted for being overly zealous in the performance of his duties, and now Cicatillo was back out and ready to continue his killing spree. 11th of March, 1985. This time the Soviets seemed to have opted for a long-term change. The man who took charge within hours of Konstantin Chernenko's death represents a new generation. The transitional period, it would seem, is over. Another Soviet leader, who was too old and too sick when he took power to hold on to it, has died, and now a 54-year-old has taken over. Someone who theoretically at least will be around for a generation. Get used to the name Mikhail Gorbachev. The tide would begin to turn in the Soviet Union when, upon the death of Konstantin Chernenko, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. With this new leader came glasnost and perestroika, transparency and restructuring across the USSR. It was an attempt to move away from the way things had been done previously. And with that, Moscow assigned Isa Kostova from the KGB Department of Crimes of Special Importance to the case. One of the first things he did was restructure the department into 3 teams focusing on 3 main areas: Shukti, Navashak, and Rostov. Anyone who had been convicted of any sexual offense, whether they were still in custody or not, systematically checked. Nightclubs and X-rated video stores were put under surveillance, and even police officers who had been dismissed for improper conduct were under scrutiny. As they grew more desperate, the police used various tactics to try and catch the killer. Hundreds of officers were deployed undercover. Hidden cameras were placed in train stations, and police women dressed up as drifters to try and lure the killer out. All of these efforts were in vain. They did catch more than 200 rapists and sexual offenders and other murderers, but not Andrei Cicatillo. August 1st, 1985. Cicatillo had been in Moscow on a business trip, and outside the Domodedovo airport, he met Natalia Poklyasheva, an 18-year-old with learning difficulties. She agreed to go for a walk with him. 2 days later, a body was found. She had been stripped and repeatedly slashed and stabbed 38 times. There was also a rope around her neck. She was later identified as Natalia. Her home was just 200 meters away. On the 27th of August, Cicatillo killed again. Another 18-year-old girl, Irina Galieva, was looking for somewhere to sleep. He said that in exchange for sexual favors, he would give her somewhere to stay. The pair went into the woods, and he failed to maintain an erection. Irina laughed at him. He responded with extreme violence, stabbing her to death. Her body was found the next day. Armed with the profile of the killer from Buchanovsky, Burikov decided to go an unusual route. He went to Novichoka's prison's death, wrote a talk to Anatoly Slivko. Anatoly Slivko was a serial killer and necrophile responsible for the appalling torture and deaths of 7 boys, and he was awaiting execution. Burikov wanted insight from someone similar to the killer they were searching for, so he decided to interview Slivko. He spoke about how offenders like him were able to evade capture and essentially blend into society without being suspected. December 1985. Helicopters were deployed to patrol the woodlands and railway lines. Plainclothed police officers were out in full force, and a volunteer militia was also drafted in to help. Little did they know, the killer walked among them as a volunteer, pretending to search for the man responsible. He now knew that these areas were the focus for the police, so he moved his crimes further afield. Reports came in from Uzbekistan where 2 very similar murders had been committed. One of the victims had been mutilated to such an extent they thought she had been run over by a combined harvester. May 16, 1987. Oleg Makarenkov was 13 years old. He was a boarding school student and had been at the railway station when he was lured away and murdered. Another boy was killed the following month. Ivan Bailovetsky was murdered in Woodland after being followed. The violence committed against him was so extreme, part of the blade had broken off. Ivan's father found his body the following day. On the 15th of September, a trip took Sikyatilo to Leningrad, where he would kill again. 16-year-old Yuri Tarashinik was lured off the train by Sikyatilo. His remains would not be found for years. Early 1988. The police presence was still prominent at transport links, but in spite of the officers, the body count would rise by a staggering 19 victims over the next 2 years. The focus of the killer now appeared to be young boys. A lot of the victims had been taken and killed in places far more public, with the risk of being caught significantly higher. Public pressure was building on the police, so patrols were ramped up and Burikov deployed plainclothes police officers and undercover police officers to areas in an attempt to catch the killer. On the 6th of April, 1988, the body of a woman who is still unidentified was found in a vacant lot of a metals factory by a station. She was estimated to be between 22 and 28 years old. She'd been disfigured and repeatedly stabbed. As he traveled the country, Sikatio would kill 8 times over the next year, one even taking place in his daughter's apartment. On the 28th of February, 1989, 16-year-old Tatiana Rizova was inside the apartment with Sikatio. She was stabbed, and then dismembered after he realized he couldn't leave her body there. The body parts were covered and tied to a sled, and he dragged it through the streets to go and dispose of them. A couple of months later in May, Chikatilo murdered Alexander Dyachinov just 1 day after his 8th birthday. It would be on the 14th of July that a taxi driver would find his body. 10-year-old Alexei Mosov would be abducted from a beach and taken into nearby woodland and murdered on the 20th of June, 1989. Less than a month later, he would kill again. 19-year-old Yelena Vargas sat waiting at a bus stop. He offered to walk her home, to save her waiting for the bus, and she agreed. He led her into some woodland, where he stabbed her to death. Her uterus was cut out, and her face was disfigured. After using her clothes to wrap up her body, he set off to his father's birthday party. 10-year-old Alexei Kobitov met Chikatilo outside of a cinema, and then vanished. He was murdered and buried in a shallow grave in a cemetery in Rostov. On the 14th of January 1990, 11-year-old Andrei Kravchenko was snatched off the streets of Shakhty, and his body would be found just over a month later. On the 7th of March, Yurioslav Makarov had skipped school and gone to the train station. From here, he would vanish. Chikatilo would murder him in the botanical gardens and viciously mutilate his body. Yurioslav was found the next day. Andrei Chikatilo had now killed more than 40, and he showed no signs of stopping. Less than a month later, Lyubov Ziva, 31 years old, was traveling to Shakhty. Her skeletal remains would not be found until August. On the 28th of July, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov was waiting for the early morning bus when he disappeared. His murder took place in the botanical gardens, just a few feet from where Yaroslav was killed. On the 17th of August, the body of 11-year-old Ivan Fomin was found. He'd been murdered 3 days before at another Cherkassk municipal beach after he had gone into some woodland to get changed. He was stabbed 42 times and mutilated. 16-year-old Vadim Grimov, a student with learning difficulties, went missing after riding a train on the 17th of October, 1990. Just 2 weeks later, Chikatilo killed Viktor Tishenko, who was 16 years old. Viktor had fought hard and broken his murderous finger. He'd also bitten him. This day there hadn't been any patrols due to a shortage of staff, but it had been previously heavily watched for months until that point. When speaking to employees at the station, one recalled that when Viktor purchased his ticket, he had done so with a tall man with gray hair and glasses. The employee said that her daughter had seen the same man a year ago. She'd listened as the man had been speaking to a boy on the train and tried to convince him to come with him, but the boy had refused to go and ran away. The police interviewed the daughter, and she not only gave a solid description, but she said he was always at the station and on the trains trying to talk to young people. The last known victim was Svetlana Korostik, a 22-year-old homeless woman who was murdered in Woodland on the 6th of November, 1990. Her body was found 7 days later. Her nipples had been bitten off, and she'd been covered in dirt. After this, as Chikatilo walked back to the station, on the platform with Sergeant Igor Rybakov, he watched as this tall, sweaty, bespectacled man staggered out of the woods. He quietly observed and moved a bit closer. The man had a bandage on his finger and blood on his ear and cheek. Sergeant Rybakov approached him and told him to give him his papers, but just as he was going to ask him more, the train arrived. It was deemed that there wasn't a real reason to keep him there, so he was allowed to board the train and leave. Rybakov did file a report about the encounter, and just a few days later, a body was found near the station. That of Svetlana Korostek, and the policeman remembered the odd man he had spoken to. A witness said he had seen the same man, trying to force a boy off a train. When looking back over the files, they wanted to know if anyone had been acting strangely, or in any way that drew them attention, and one name from Sergeant Rybakov's report stood out, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. General Isa Kostoev asked the officers to check where Chikatilo was on the 14th of May, 1988. They knew for a fact that one of the victims had been killed that day in Ilovaisk. His work record showed that he had been there that day too. This was now starting to slot together. His strange behavior, his description fitting the ones that witnesses had given, his history of sexual abuse. They knew they needed to find Chikatilo before he struck again. November 20th, 1990. Chikatilo went to get his finger x-rayed after it had been broken by Viktor Tishchenko. He then went to buy some beer, and noticed a young boy whom he tried to speak to. He was quickly scared off when a woman appeared. He tried to talk to another boy who was soon called back by his mother. Then it happened. 3 plainclothes police officers walked up to him and took him into custody. He was carrying a briefcase with him which contained a knife, Vaseline, and rope, the same items he had been carrying when he was arrested in 1984. He was now back in custody, and the arrest was caught on film. He sat in the car and didn't say a single word as he was taken to Mikhail Fedosov's office of the Department of Internal Affairs. While he sat in custody, officers went straight over to his house to search it, and what they found painted a very dark picture. A hammer, more than 20 knives, and a pair of shoes that matched the footprints found at the scene of a murder of an unidentified woman were found. He was processed and photographed, and then put straight into isolation. As he sat in his cell, many wondered who was Andrei Chikatilo. The police initially had dismissed the report that Buchanovsky had generated about who the killer would likely be. But upon Chikatilo's arrest, it had proven to be eerily accurate. He was 54 years old, impotent, isolated, had a history of allegations of sexual abuse and few friends. 1936, Yablano, Ukraine. The population had been through, and was still suffering the effects of a devastating famine following Joseph Stalin's enforcement of collectivization. On the 16th of October that year, a baby boy was born, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. Just a few years later, the situation in the USSR would become even tougher when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. According to the National World War II Museum, the USSR would lose 24 million people in the conflict. His father, Roman, was conscripted but was later captured by the Nazi forces and held prisoner. In 1943, Chikatilo's sister was born while his father was away. The family lived in a tiny one-room house, so it was reported that potentially his mother had been the victim of a sexual assault by a Nazi soldier and Chikatilo had witnessed it. Roman would eventually be released after the war, but the stigma of having been captured and his perceived cowardice followed him, and Andrei would also be the subject of bullying as a result. He was only a child when his father came home, but he too criticized his father's alleged betrayal to his country. As a child, Andrei would not typically play with other children, preferring to be by himself, reading with a particular interest in stories of Soviet partisans who had captured and tortured German prisoners. He was already the target of bullies, and despite having extremely poor vision, he refused to wear glasses. Fearing they would make him an even bigger target, his excellent reading skills and memory saw him become the political information officer, and he was also the editor of the school newspaper. He had little to no social life, and he had even less experience with girls. The young Chikatilo struggled with crippling shyness and isolation. When he was 15, he had his first sexual experience with a girl. He overpowered her, and during a quick struggle, he ejaculated. This encounter led to him being bullied more and solidified the combination for him. Sexual pleasure and extreme violence went hand in hand. It's believed that when Chikatilo was born, he suffered a buildup of excess fluid, putting pressure on his brain. It's believed that this led to genital urinary tract problems that were apparent in his childhood, teens, and adulthood. He wet the bed until he was in his teenage years and would fail to sustain an erection, although he was able to ejaculate. He went on to take part in national service between 1957 and 1960, and following this, he relocated to Rodeo Novonesvitevsky. After saving his money, his parents and sister moved in with him, and his sister was worried by his stunted love life. So she arranged for him to meet a girl, and the pair would marry in 1963. In spite of Chikatilo's sexual problems and his apparent lack of interest in sex, the pair would go on to have a son and a daughter, and all appeared relatively normal for the family. He enrolled at the Rostov Liberal Arts University, and in 1970, he left his job as a telephone engineer and began working at a school, having gained his degrees in engineering, Russian literature, and Marxist-Leninism. But this job would not last long. After the allegations began to swirl around him about attempted sexual assaults, abuse and acts of voyeurism, he was out. In 1978, he ended up at vocational school number 33 in Shukti. He would then buy a small rundown house opposite the Grushevka River. This would be where he would take his first victim, Yelena Zakotnova. It would also be his boss that had told the police the sketch of the suspects Svetlana had seen talking to Yelena looked like his employee named Andrei. After killing Yelena, Chikatilo would go quiet, and there would be no reported victims for the next 3 years. During this time, he couldn't hold down a job after repeated allegations of sexual abuse, and he was eventually dismissed from the mining school in 1981. Following this, he began to work as a clerk at a raw materials factory in Rostov, and this job allowed him to travel for work looking for factory supplies. It gave him more access to potential victims. But what about his wife? Had she known anything? Senior investigator Amirkin Yandev, who had joined the team in 1985, said to her, "It can't be that you didn't know. He would come home dirty, as an animal bloody. You must have known." But she emphatically denied any knowledge of his crimes. "If I had known what my husband was doing, I would have done something to stop him. But how was I to know?" she said. He had told his wife that his clothes had become dirty, as work would get him to load filthy crates. Yandev added that Chikatilo appeared to be somewhat afraid of his wife, cowering if she even raised her voice at him. And now this man was sitting in isolation, having finally been apprehended, and the relief was palpable. However, for those who had been on the case, the 500 police officers and 50 investigators, this, quite frankly, had been nothing short of a disaster and embarrassment. Charges of violations relating to the botched investigations were brought against detectives, but it remains to be seen if any of them were actually punished. In spite of the huge police presence, relentless and often brutal interrogations, the undercover officers, etc., he had always been one step ahead. Amir Khan Yandev said that the law enforcement bodies were at fault mainly, and that they relied too much on the biological facts. What did we learn? That you have to check anyone. He added, nobody connected to this case has anything to boast about. For Colonel Alexander Zanisovsky, who had arrested Chikatilo in 1984 and then been demoted, his feelings had been proven absolutely right. Am I mad? When it finally came out that it was him, I was very mad indeed. How can you not be mad when so many more women and children died? November 21st, 1990. The interrogation of Andrei Chikatilo began. In charge of the questioning was Isa Kostoyev, but he was getting nowhere. Chikatilo was not admitting to anything. A week later, the accused wrote to the Prosecutor General of Russia. It read in part, "I felt a kind of madness and ungovernability in perverted sexual acts." I couldn't control my actions because from childhood I was unable to realize myself as a real man and a complete human being. It wasn't a confession by any means, but it was the most he'd said so far. The following day he would admit to something, not the murders, but to sexually assaulting the students he used to work with. The next day, another letter arrived to the prosecutor general. My inconsistent behavior should not be misconstrued as an attempt to avoid responsibility for any acts I have committed. One could argue even after my arrest, I was not fully aware of their dangerous and serious nature. My case is peculiar to me alone. It is not a fear of responsibility that makes me act this way, but my inner psychic and nervous tension. I am prepared to give testimony about the crimes, but please do not torment me with their details, for my psyche would not be able to bear it. It never entered my mind to conceal anything from the investigation. Everything which I have done makes me shudder. I only feel gratitude to the investigating bodies for having captured me. But he still wasn't giving them what they needed, a confession to the murders. Kostoyev asked Dr. Buchanovsky to help in the interview. He agreed as long as the notes he made were not used for evidence. November 30th, 1990. Dr. Buchanovsky told Chikatilo that he believed his actions were rooted in mental illness. He also told him he would be willing to talk to his family to help them understand what was going on. He explained that they were trying to understand the killer from a scientific point of view. And finally, the tactics started to pay off. Chikatilo, obviously feeling flattered by the approach, began to talk. Buchanovsky had Chikatilo's wife come in, and this resulted in the first display of emotion from the accused. He broke down in tears. He read the report that Buchanovsky had made detailing the profile of the killer. "Yes, it's me," he cried. A few days later, on the 5th of December, finally he would confess. Once he began to talk, he wouldn't stop. He had been accused of 36 murders, but he said this was wrong. He admitted to the rape and murders of 56 women and children. Finally, after a 12-year reign of terror, the butcher of Rostov, the Rostov Ripper, the forest strip killer, Andrei Chikatilo, had been caught. He would take the officers to the sites of many of the murders and revealed previously undiscovered bodies. He said that he had greatly resented the sexual activity that he alleged he saw amongst drifters in the area. It was a painful reminder to him of his own sexual problems. "And I began to wonder whether these low-class elements have the right to exist," he said. He spoke about his modus operandi. With his female victims, he would tell them he knew a shortcut to a different station or promise them food if they went with him. With the boys, he would offer them chewing gum or the promise of watching a horror film or pornography. I'd just say to all of them, "Let's go, let's have something to eat or whatever." They were everywhere at every stop. I didn't have to search for them. He said that once they got into the woods, I would start to shake. It was like a fever. On the 7th of December, he was taken to Shukthi and led officers to an unmarked shallow grave. He was filmed as he stood cold and emotionless as the police dug and revealed a child's shoe. For the officers, watching the remains of Alexei Kaftanov being recovered was haunting. Chikatilo also admitted to murdering Yelena Zakharovna in 1978, a crime for which Alexander Kravchenko had already been executed. Using a mannequin, he would also show them how he had killed his victims. One of the most gruesome aspects of this case were the allegations of cannibalism. Chikatilo was fascinated by cannibalism, and this was something that had gone back to his childhood. He had been told by his mother that during the famine in the 1930s, his older brother had been kidnapped, murdered and eaten by those who were starving. Buchanovsky spoke about this and the impact this story had had on Chikatilo. He found out about it when he was 4. He reacted with such terror to the idea that it was possible to kidnap and eat a child that he remembered it all his life. On the one hand, he found it terrible and frightening. On the other, he had an unhealthy interest in it. This story of his older brother does remain unconfirmed, and we will likely never know if it is actually true. Andrei Chikatilo was tested and examined for 8 weeks at a psychiatric hospital in Moscow. Andrei Kachenko led the examinations, and he described someone who had abnormal development from childhood, influenced by his experiences of war, poverty, and famine. He said that Chikatilo had explained that the more time went on, the less he cared about the gender of his victims, and more so about the power and control he could exert over them. He had gouged out the eyes of many of them due to the belief that what the victim had last seen would be imprinted on their eyes. Buchanovsky said that Chikatilo was classed as a schizoid psychopath, with the term schizoid being used because he imagined himself in lofty roles like a partisan, but in real life, he called himself an idiot, a good-for-nothing. He also said that there must be a biological route for Chikatilo's behavior, and although it was not clearly defined or understood, he said it appeared to show a predisposition for some to commit certain offenses. Buchanovsky said that it had not been his intention to murder his first victim, Yelena Zakharova, but due to the overwhelming sexual pleasure, killing became his goal to try and recreate that experience. Andrei Chikatilo was found fit to stand trial, but he appealed, saying that the psychiatric evaluation was biased. In spite of strange lesions on Chikatilo's brain, and against the advice of Buchanovsky, no insanity plea was permitted. It was argued he had planned the murders, carried weapons and rope with him as he'd traveled, targeted the most vulnerable, and successfully avoided being caught for more than a decade. It was determined he was indeed fit to stand, and would soon go on trial. The 26th of December, 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formally dissolved. This meant that Andrei Chikatilo's upcoming trial would be one of the first major ones in a post-Soviet era. But for Alexander Kravchenko, the man who had been wrongfully executed for a murder, he did not commit, it was too late. In 1991, Russia's Supreme Court posthumously rescinded his sentence. The 14th of April, 1992, the trial began. Standing in the dock with his head shaved, the 57-year-old former head teacher and father of two stood accused of some of the most depraved crimes one could imagine against society's most vulnerable. Throughout it, Andrei Chikatilo was confined to a metal cage. Not to protect the public, but to protect him from them, the court was filled with the bereaved, the devastated, the angry. Those whose loved ones had been so cruelly and brutally taken from them, knowing that they would likely have torn him limb from limb. He was kept in the cage, surrounded by guards, to stop that from happening. Cameras and reporters were also allowed in a very unusual move. Just to read out what Chikatilo had been accused of took Judge Leonid Akabzanov 2 days, with more than 200 files to read from. The nature of the crimes were so graphic, some in the courtroom fainted, and even some of the guards were so overwhelmed that they needed to sit down. After the charges were read out, Andrei Chikatilo was allowed to address the court, and he did so for nearly 2 hours. He described himself as someone who had been persecuted and suffered since childhood. He said he had been mocked over his sexual problems, and this, combined with going away constantly for work and having issues at work, all led to this devastating result. I dreamed of a big political career, he said, and ended up with this nothing life, in stations and on trains. This rambling speech was just the beginning. His bizarre behavior included singing, talking nonsense, and at one point even pulling his trousers down and exposing himself to the court. Many saw this as an attempt to present himself as mentally ill. Throughout the trial, the judge used powers afforded to him under the legal system to interrogate Chikatilo. He asked repeatedly for him to explain why he had done what he had done, and how he could be so bereft of empathy for those whom he had hurt. Don't you imagine what excruciating pain it caused your victims when you bit off their tongues? I've seen hundreds of corpses, but I've never seen anything like this. We want to understand your psychology. Were you thinking, I can make anyone I want a victim, or what? For 1 minute of pleasure, you demanded the life of a child. Didn't you think about that? Chikatilo mumbled back, I can't explain. One person from the public gallery called him a damned soul and an evil sadist. Lydia Kovatova, the mother of 10-year-old Alexei, whom Chikatilo had abducted and murdered on the 28th of August, 1989, said they should rip him apart like a dog. I hope he dies the most horrible death like my son did. As tensions rose, the courtroom soon began to smell of valerian drops, a tranquilizer distributed by the court-appointed nurses. The court heard how many of the victims were poor or sex workers. They'd been lured into surrounding forests with the promise of food and money. Other victims were teenagers or children, who upon seeing a kind-looking stranger had asked him for help. Many were runaways or drifters, so society would not immediately notice their disappearance. He would also target orphans and those with learning difficulties. Polina Iskatina, whose daughter was one of his victims, said, why bother trying him? If they gave him to me, I'd tear him apart. I'd gouge his eyes out and cut him up. I'd do everything to him that he did to my daughter. My daughter had 46 knife wounds. Her womb was cut out. Why did he do that? What did he need with it? I can't understand it. It all just won't fit into my head. Every day we talk through it all, and it still doesn't make sense. How can you torment someone like that? The judge said he had mutilated the bodies to give himself the illusion of having performed a real sexual act. He received sexual satisfaction after he knifed a person and saw blood when a victim suffered. With no sign of remorse in his voice, he described himself as a crazed wolf, saying he just turned into a beast, into a wild animal. He said that he would use what he referred to as his magnetism to ensure his victims would follow him into the woods. Then, overwhelmed with excitement, he would ambush them. When I used my knife, it brought psychological relief. I know I have to be destroyed. I understand. I was a mistake of nature. Buchanovsky said he understands that what he did was bad, that he killed people. But that doesn't mean he's sorry. The judge appealed to his conscience, but he's only sorry for himself. He would continuously disrupt proceedings in court, which led to him being taken out. Due to his constant outbursts, most of the evidence would be heard without him. When he was brought back in, there was one thing the judge agreed with him on. The refusal of the Soviet Union to acknowledge that serial killers were such a thing in the USSR had enabled him to evade capture for as long as he did. The trial would go on until August. And when it was time for the court to retire to consider their verdict, a man in the public gallery threw a bar through the cage, and it missed Chikatilo's head by a matter of inches. The man in question was taken out of court by the guards, but soon after released. The verdict arrived 2 months later, in October 1992. Judge Leonid Akabzanov read out the findings to the court. It was 330 pages long. His voice broke with emotion as he did this. The judge also heavily criticized the police, saying that their incompetence had meant it had taken them so long to catch Chikatilo. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 of the 53 counts of murder. His victims included 21 boys ranging from 8 to 16, 14 girls aged between 9 and 17, and 17 women who were 18 and older. His crimes had been committed in southern Russia, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine, and spanned the course of 12 years, from 1978 to 1990. Every guilty verdict came with a separate death sentence. The court, packed with some 200 people, erupted in applause. As the verdicts were read out, Chikatilo shouted from inside his cage, whining, "I demand the podium. Get me a lawyer. I didn't confess to anything. Show me the corpses." From inside his cage, he kicked over his wooden bench and called the judge a swindler and a con man. He was let out of court as a result, and with that, the trial was over. Chikatilo was now awaiting the day of his execution. Although he continued to appeal it, the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, refused a final appeal. The sentence was final. While on death row, Chikatilo gave an interview. He said, "I'm nothing but an actor who's performed a role to earn an Oscar and get into the Guinness Book of Records. That's all. Could the person who's written the scenario for all of this explain it to the people? I am asked to describe how it all happened. But what can I explain when they didn't show me the case file? They hid it. They're hiding it all. They've put great things in there, painting me as a beast. That's all. And now people look at me. They must put up with me here." Following his conviction, Andrei Chikatilo's wife and children would change their names and move away from the area. The 14th of February, 1994, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was taken from his cell and executed with a bullet to the back of the head. Following the investigation, when serial killers continued to come out of Rostov, investigators used what Buchanovsky had put in place in the new killer department, which had emerged from the team who had pursued Chikatilo. Dr. Buchanovsky would later be given an award from Moscow for services in the hunt for serial killers. The story of the hunt for Andrei Chikatilo has been told in countless books, television shows, and films, all from varying points of view, highlighting not only the complexities of the case, but how he was able to evade capture for as long as he did. Films like 1995's Citizen X, showing the bureaucratic problems that faced the investigators trying to track the killer down, and books like The Killer Department by Robert Cullen, upon which that film is based. The level of destruction that Andrei Chikatilo caused is really impossible to fully comprehend. People were relentlessly and wrongly pursued. Many were mercilessly interrogated. So many lives were ruined as a result. One person had been wrongly executed. One suspect had made an attempt to end his life, and another had taken his own life. It's genuinely difficult to know what to say when bringing a case like this one to a close. We will likely never know the true extent of his offending. The least we can do is remember his victims and those left behind. More than 50 women and children, human beings with hopes and dreams, treated with such disgraceful inhumanity, it is hard to even put into words. Story 3. Rochester, New York, July 2016. In the small, sleepy village of Pittsford lived the Rideout family. 50-year-old IT specialist and programmer Craig, his wife Laura, and their 7 children. The eldest was Colin, followed by Andrew, Alexander, Elizabeth, Julia, Patrick, and Madeline. Craig had met and married Laura in 1993, and they couldn't wait to start a family of their own, having their first baby just a short while later. And being extremely close to his sister Robin and her children, everyone said that family was all that mattered to Craig. He was well known in his community, often working with youth groups, organizing charity events, and in his spare time he loved gaming. Though a big and bustling family had always been a dream of Craig's, this undoubtedly came with financial issues, and he often was away due to his long working hours. Robin said that Laura didn't really seem to worry as much as Craig about money. But things got more stressful when bankruptcy conversations started happening, and the family were forced to move house and downsize. Laura had openly not been happy for a while, and a wedge had started forming between her and Craig and her in-laws. Laura and some of the kids soon stopped showing up for holiday dinners at Craig's family, and when Robin said, "Are you guys coming?" one of the children would often respond with, "Oh, Mom's not feeling well," but then another kid would say, "That's not true, Mom didn't want to come." Laura presented Craig with divorce papers in 2014, and sometime during this period she got close to and moved in with a family friend, Paul Tucci, known as PJ. Paul's wife Jennifer had sadly passed away around the same time as Craig and Laura split. Paul and Craig actually went back as far as college, and their children had grown up together, almost into one big family. Paul was even godfather to Colin. Craig wanted Laura to be happy and loved his old friend dearly. So he was putting on a brave face, but deep down he was finding it tough seeing them together. With a pending divorce and custody issues now happening, his stresses were mounting. Craig was eventually awarded primary custody of Patrick and Madeline, and Elizabeth and Julia would also live with him. His 3 oldest children, Andrew, Colin, and Alex, who were over the age of 18, could live where they wanted, with Colin and Alex staying with Laura and Paul. Craig was now trying to rebuild bridges with the older children, as well as his ex-wife. The relationships, especially with Alex and Colin, seemed to be going south for reasons he just couldn't understand. Alex had put a post out on Facebook calling his dad a coward and emotionally abusive. Robin had seen the post and immediately called Craig. This was so out of left field. Robin said her brother was devoted to his kids and would never intentionally hurt them. She wanted to respond to Alex and defend Craig, but Craig said to leave it. He didn't want to create a public scene. On July 13, 2016, Craig was woken up by an intruder in his bedroom. Someone dressed all in black had burst in, plucked a hair from his arm, stole his BlackBerry, and ran off. Craig found his keys in a plant pot outside. Craig told police he thought the person in his house was possibly his son, Colin, playing some sort of weird prank. But when an email from Colin came in, it was clear there was no joking around here. His oldest son leveraged more heavy accusations against Craig, and the email was cutting. He called him Craig, not Dad, accused him of dragging out the divorce to hurt his mother, faking the break-in at his home, and blaming his children for what he called heinous deeds. At this point, Craig, already frustrated with Laura's attempts to turn everyone against him, was firm with Colin. He asked why he couldn't just reach out to him instead of ignoring him for months, then launching an attack via email. And as for the divorce and custody, Craig knew exactly what was going on in the courts. He had even complained to his attorney that Laura had misscheduled pickups, showing up without notice, changing plans, and missing picking the children up from school. One day, Laura had even left all of the children on Craig's doorstep without telling him. Robin also said that if Craig was abusive, there was no way he would have been awarded custody. Safe to say Craig was dealing with a lot and was leaning on his sister, now more than ever. He would go to her for advice about everything and anything, and they were in contact almost hourly. But on the morning of July 19, 2016, the prompt contact and swift replies were non-existent. Robin was not able to get through to Craig either on his work or personal phone. She called his work, but was told he had sent an email the night before saying his daughter was sick and he wouldn't be contactable. Robin drove straight to his house. His minivan was missing, and as she walked towards the door, she saw a figure through the window. It was Laura. Laura said she came over to look for Craig as the children said he wasn't there when they woke up. She had stayed to clean the kitchen, as there was a funny smell. Robin nervously took a quick look around the house and saw his shoes neatly lined up, his jackets on the door, and his belongings still there. Unable to put her panic aside anymore, she called 911. My brother has not been answering texts or cell phone calls or emails. I could be making a mountain out of a molehill. The police obtained a search warrant, and a missing persons report was filed. Laura, along with Craig's two youngest children, Madeline and Patrick, spoke to the officers. Obviously, you're a little bit concerned about him, I guess. I don't even know where to think. Was he there when you woke up? The last time you saw your dad was yesterday. He was playing video games on the computer. He went to the bathroom, and then he went downstairs, and then that night he was downstairs, and then he disappeared in the morning. What was the last time you saw him? 11:30 last night, when he was going to bed. And then what happened this morning? I wasn't there, so I was just guessing he went to work. Nothing seemed disturbed. No expensive items were missing. There were no smashed windows or signs of a forced entry. Inside the basement, things were a little more messy than upstairs, but as it was only used for storage, this wasn't that weird. However, as they looked closer, they saw red spots on some of the boxes, and inside a bin bag there was a handmade garrote covered in blood. Some bags contained leatherwork gloves which looked stained with blood, and a spray of luminol found blood, not only on the floor, but on the walls too. Blood did not look like it had been there long at all. As everything was bagged up and sent for testing, investigators turned their attention to Craig's phone. Calls were going through, so his phone was still on. This meant that getting data from his phone provider and finding the last known location would be a lot easier. It showed the phone as being about 50 miles away from his house. And in this exact spot, all those miles away, little did anyone realize another investigation was underway. At 7:53, that morning the police had received a call. We discovered there in the woods there's a body under a tarp just down the road. They found a shovel by the roadside, and there was a trail of blood too. They followed it over to some brown tarp, and when they walked around the back they saw a foot poking out. Police and paramedics arrived, but it was clear that nothing could be done, and it did not take long for them to identify the deceased male. Investigators suddenly heard a phone buzzing. It was coming from under the tarp. The caller ID was Robin Drew, Craig's sister. They had to wait for an official identification, but it was pretty clear it was Craig. The medical examiner said he had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head and neck and facial fractures. There was a deep indentation of the skin all the way around the neck, which showed a device was used to strangle him. A strong acid had been poured onto his body to try and make him unidentifiable. It was so powerful it had eaten through his clothes and even exposed bone in some places. Found in the tarp were white bottle caps, potentially the caps from the bottles containing the acid. They did not believe he had been killed there. The murder scene was likely his basement, and then his killer or killers had moved him here. Later that evening, as Robin was still at Craig's house, Laura and Paul showed up with the two youngest children. Laura told the detective they were dropping the children off as per their arrangements, and had they found Craig. She admitted she'd been at the house earlier that day cleaning, but she and Paul had no idea where Craig was, and was hoping he had returned home from wherever he'd been. Robin told the police that her brother had a camera in the house, which they had found disguised as a digital alarm clock in the kitchen, and it was pointing directly at the main walkway in the house. If anyone was to enter or leave Craig's home, they should have been caught. But there was nothing even remotely concerning on the footage. It showed the family going about their day, cooking and going to school, but nothing more than that. It seemed that once the memory was full, it did not rewrite itself. It simply stopped recording. So sadly, they didn't have anything around the time they believed Craig had been killed. Such a positive lead had just reached a dead end. The search continued. With the murder scene in one county and his body in another, investigators had a lot of ground to cover. But only a day later, on July 21st, investigators were alerted to a location chillingly called Devil's Bathtub in Mendham Ponds Park. A local dog walker had raised the alarm when she had spotted two people acting suspiciously, throwing rubbish bags out of their car and into the pond. The officers apprehended them. It was none other than Colin Rideout and Alex Rideout. So what's going on? You and your brother are out for a walk. Well, basically we were just like out, and then suddenly people show up. And it's like, well, I've never really encountered police before, so it was like, you've never been in trouble before, right? No, I don't really do drugs or drink or really party. I'm 19. I'm doing college next year. At this point, only Robin knew that her brother was dead. It was as good as confirmed, but not until the dental records came back. Have you heard anything from your brother? Well, I emailed him last night. I didn't hear from him. I heard from him Monday. And he picked up my brother. And sister, I think Tuesday. I've been kind of worried about him for like stuff's just been freaking me out. He'd always threaten. I could just disappear. But I figured he was on the next flight to Mexico. Colin told the detectives he was worried about his father, hoping he was found safe and well. And Alex was claiming he had no idea what was in the bags. Colin then admitted that his mom had asked them to dump everything. It was just something my mom told me, like, hey, when did your mom tell you to do that? It was this morning. Did she give you the bag? Yeah. I'm worried about what's in that bag, and I'm going to tell you if you tell me what's in that bag before I see what's in that bag, it'll be better for you. I don't know what's in the bag. Do you believe in God? I do, yeah. Have you seen a tree? Yeah. I'm hoping maybe we can hold a tree for tomorrow night. Yeah. Before long, Alex actually planted them at their dad's house, admitting he had seen blood in the basement. The bags contained paper towels covered in blood, bloody clothing and shoes, and 4 bottles of very strong drain cleaner, matching the ones found with his body. Investigators had the idea to go to get the brothers some food and a drink, so they went to a local fast food chain with the intentions of taking the straws they used to obtain the DNA. After this, Alex and Colin were both arrested for tampering with evidence, but the police knew there was more to it. They then headed straight to Paul and Laura's house to place them under arrest too. Laura was shocked, and the police said to her, "You must have been expecting this." She coolly replied, "If I was expecting this, I would have put on some makeup before grabbing some heels to wear to the station." She seemed very confident that she would be returning home. A look around the couple's house found that she had a spare fob to Craig's car and some blue tape that was used to make the homemade garrote that they believed was used to strangle Craig. However, at this point, the 4 could only be arrested for tampering with evidence. A father of 7 dead his estranged wife, and 2 sons charged with covering up his murder. But who actually killed him? We went into the neighborhood where this father was killed, and where police say 2 of his children tried to cover up the murder. He went missing Tuesday night. Just 1 day later, his body was found wrapped in a tarp in Yates County, and now 3 of his family members are charged in connection to his death. His 2 sons are still locked up behind bars behind you. They're not charged with murder, they're just charged with trying to cover it up, right? Yeah, that's exactly right, Berkeley. The 2 sons and his estranged wife have both been charged with tampering with physical evidence at the moment. But this is still a very active investigation, and police tell us it is very likely that at least one of the 3 of them will be charged with murder soon. The folks who live in Rideout's townhome community relieved it wasn't a random crime, but still saddened by the loss. Still, it doesn't make it any less horrifying to think that a neighbor would, that anyone kills anyone else. That to me is just unfathomable. Alright, Jen, thanks. Now, if you're like us, you can't help but think of the similarities between this case and the Charlie Tan case. And now, just like Charlie, there is this GoFundMe page set up by friends and family of Alex and Colin Rideout, and in the introduction to it, it says, "This is not the first time something like this has happened in Pittsburgh," referring obviously to the Charlie Tan case. And in just about 5 hours, they've already raised a little more than $3,000. The goal is $55,000. They were eventually let out on bail. A few days later, it came as no surprise when the medical examiner officially confirmed it was definitely Craig's body. As Sheriff Spike previously mentioned, our investigators received reports of a body that was found in a wooded area near Adams Road in Yates County, in the town of Jerusalem. The Sheriff's Office here and the Yates County Sheriff's Office and members of the New York State Police began a joint investigation, and we believe the body of the individual found in Yates County is our missing person, Craig Rideout. And we're awaiting forensic confirmation from the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Office before we can officially announce that. However, based on some of the evidence that we found throughout the investigation, we believe that to be the case. In connection with this homicide investigation, we're announcing the arrest of Alexander Rideout and Colin Rideout and Laura Rideout. With the 4 suspects out on bail, the police needed to connect everyone to the place where Craig's body had been dumped, and they had been pulling cameras from the main roads between the 2 counties. Investigators looked at the cell phone data again, which highlighted a rough few locations of where his phone had been. Using that information, they were able to plot out a route from Craig's house to the location his body was found in and request all footage on said route. They knew his phone had left home at roughly 3 a.m. on the morning of July 19th, when his body was being moved in traffic would have been light, so spotting cars was much easier. They came across some footage from a hotel about halfway between the two locations. They captured two vehicles speeding through the frame, very close to each other linked to Craig's moving phone. The footage at night was unclear, so they could not make out any identifiable features of the passing vehicles. They wanted to see if the same route back home was used, so they fast-forwarded the tape to see if they could catch the vehicles in a convoy. They caught a dark-colored sedan and a white minivan matching the description of Craig's van going back along the same road. They were able to locate the vehicles traveling together on 6 more cameras. Though they did not know the final destination of these vehicles, this confirmed their thoughts that there was more than one person involved in this murder. Craig's van was eventually found in a parking lot of the local park and ride, but with no cameras covering this spot, they couldn't tell who parked it. Using card transactions, investigators were led to a Walmart. The Rideout St. Paul had made 3 trips to Walmart in the 24 hours around Craig's death. First they saw a sedan pull up and a male got out of the back seat and went into the store. They identified him as Colin. He was captured purchasing the shovel along with 4 pairs of work gloves. He exited and returned to the same car, but extra enhancements on another camera showed at least 3 other people in the vehicle, but it was just too hard to see them clearly. Using more receipts and card data, another transaction at the same Walmart was located for the drain cleaner. It showed Laura, Colin, and one of her daughters in the store. Colin then purchased the cleaner. The brown tarp that had been used to wrap up Craig's body, more drain cleaner, the bungee cord used to make the murder weapon, and a bottle of Coke had also been purchased at another Walmart on the 19th of July at 9 p.m., just a few hours before they believed Craig was killed. Laura Rideout was seen entering, but this time with Paul Tucci. Police started to test the DNA on the uncovered items. The clothes found in the bags at the pond matched the clothes worn by Colin when he was seen purchasing the shovel. And Alex's DNA was found on the items in the basement of Craig's home as well. The trousers Laura was seen wearing when purchasing the brown tarp were also in the bags, and her DNA was also found on a bottle of Diet Coke in Craig's basement. Paul Tucci's clothes that he was seen wearing in the Walmart footage were never located. However, his DNA was found on things inside the bag in the pond. Laura, Paul, Colin, and Alex were all charged with second-degree murder and tampering with evidence, and they pleaded not guilty to everything. Further investigation in Paul's home led to one more arrest. 19-year-old Theodore Tucci, Paul's son, was charged with being in possession of several child abuse material. The only motive that presented itself was the pending move and custody battle. Detectives believed that Laura had done everything she could to try and turn her children against Craig. Laura and Paul had already taken out a lease on a place in North Carolina just 3 weeks before Craig was killed, and when Laura said she wanted her children to go with them, Craig said no way. This set the plan in motion. Just days after signing the lease, Laura sent a text to Colin asking for his help in getting custody of her 2 youngest children. Via text, they made a plan to try and get her 2 youngest daughters to provoke Craig somehow. They hoped he would get angry enough or aggressive enough so Laura could call the police and have them taken away. Colin texted one of his younger sisters asking them to make sure they called 911 if he even raised his voice. The correct verbiage to get their attention would be, "He's trying to break down the door, and I'm afraid he's going to kill my sister," he added. Elizabeth barricaded herself and her siblings in a room. But the plan went wrong as Craig did not react angrily at all. Later, Laura complained via text to Colin about the plan having gone awry. She was focused on Julia telling Colin she had fucked everything up and he should knock some sense into her. Colin's response to his mother was, "Turn off Julia's phone right now. She'll break in 48 hours. Robin and the rest of his family reiterated there was just no way. There have obviously been negative comments that have been made against the character of my brother Craig. I would ask that careful consideration be given prior to believing this negativity. My younger brother was a generous, loving person. It was such a dark and devious situation that had played out, and police said Laura had really poisoned everyone's minds. Will there be 1 trial or 4 trials for Craig Rideout's murder?" In an unusual twist, it was decided that all 4 would be tried together at the same time. Everyone turned on each other. Laura's lawyers were pointing the finger at Colin. Colin's were saying it was Laura. Paul's attorney said they didn't know who it was, but it couldn't have been Paul. And it was true, they really had no idea who had actually killed Craig. But there was so much evidence to be presented the prosecution knew it was still a strong case against the 4. During the 5-week trial, prosecutors called more than 50 witnesses and introduced nearly 700 pieces of evidence. The theory was that Craig and Laura's two youngest children were dropped off that evening, and Laura said she wanted to talk to Craig about the impending move. She somehow lured Craig into the basement where his sons, who had their own key along with Paul, were already waiting. Craig had tried to put up a fight, but he was struck in the face by someone and strangled before he could fight anymore. The defense lawyers all rested their cases without calling anyone. Closing arguments took place on the first anniversary of Craig's death, and this only added to an already emotionally charged court case. The jury deliberated for 5 days. Alexander Rideout. You've been found not guilty of murder in the second degree, guilty of 2 counts of tampering with physical evidence. Colin Rideout. The jury has found you guilty of murder in the second degree and guilty of 2 counts of tampering with physical evidence. You're remanded to the custody of this sheriff pending sentence. Laura Rideout. The jury has convicted you of murder in the second degree, tampering with physical evidence and burglary in the second degree. Laura Rideout was found guilty of second-degree murder along with burglary and tampering with evidence. Laura Rideout, count number 1, murder in the second degree, 154. Count 2, tampering with physical evidence, 1 of the 4 years in state prison. Burglary in the second degree, 15 years plus 5 years post-release supervision. Those terms are run consecutively. She later received 28 years to life and will first be eligible for parole in 2055. She will be 83 years old. Colin was found guilty of murder and tampering with evidence, and also received a 28-year to life sentence. He will be eligible for parole in 2043 when he is 50 years old. Alex was found not guilty of murder, but was found guilty of tampering with evidence, and received a 2 to 8 year sentence. Mr. Tucci, you've been found not guilty of murder in the second degree and tampering with physical evidence. Any bail you have posted is hereby released. Any records concerning this matter are hereby sealed. Paul Tucci was acquitted completely. The judge called it a premeditated evil and diabolical scheme. His community is, and should be horrified of what happened to Greg Rackham. The manner in which he was murdered, the manner in which he was disposed of. And at trial, I think the proof was very clear. Alexander Riedel was in the basement, and he was at Devil's Ponds, or at Devil's Ponds. Colin Riedel was in the basement, and was in Devil's Ponds, and was there at the time Gregory Riedel died. Based upon the blood spatter, it certainly testified here at the trial, and that same group put Laura Riedel in the basement at the time Gregory Riedel was killed. I, like Mr. Green, have been doing this for quite some time. This is one of the ugliest things I've ever seen. All rise, court is in recess. This was so much of a punch in the gut for Craig's family. Agnes, Craig's mother, said, "People have asked me, how does a mother convince her children to kill their father? My true belief is that you start with a little lie, then you begin to believe it, and eventually you're telling it to your kids." There was an effort to create a narrative for a long time. I had the honor in January of 1993 to be a part of one of the best days of my brother's life, his marriage to Laura Basin. They were young, happy, and in love. Together they brought 7 beautiful children into this world. He loved each of them. Little did I know what the future would bring. It is beyond comprehension that 23 years later, I would find Laura in Craig's kitchen, and then that she would be found guilty of his murder. Even worse is that one of their children would be found to have been intricately involved in these events, and that another was involved with tampering of evidence. On top of that, Laura tried to involve their younger children in earlier events prior to Craig's death. I have been worried about not only my husband and all of our children and their response to this atrocity, but the effect that it's had on my mother. She has not only lost her son, but 2 of her grandchildren to jail and prison time. Not only that, but we have not had contact with the rest of my brother's children. We can only hope that we can have some kind of a relationship with them in the future, and hope that we have not been painted with the same falseness that their mother painted their father. The lead investigator said that despite the verdict, he was positive Paul was directly involved. He believes Paul was the one that struck Craig in the face. And given the fact that Craig was over 6 foot and 200 pounds, Paul would have been instrumental in getting him up the stairs and into the van. Paul gave a handful of interviews to local media in the days after the verdict, and appeared in a Dateline documentary too. He put his house up for sale and moved away from western New York. The last anyone heard, he lived a short distance away from the prison in Westchester County, where Laura was incarcerated. And a couple of years into her sentence, he was still visiting her in prison. How long do you wait for someone? I'll never turn my back on her or those kids. Hopefully we see a sunset together, he said. He still denies having anything to do with the murder and claims he had no idea who was behind it, saying he missed his old friend dearly and hoped that the truth would one day come out. He even sent an email to a journalist, saying in part, "Frankly, I have never seen more one-sided reporting on a topic ever." Robin is the least credible resource, as she was not only uninvolved in the Rideout affairs for 20 years, she had the most to gain from his death. She is now the sole heir to the Rideout estate, and also the insurance agent for the Rideout clan. Your failure to even research any other aspect makes you complicit in the whole sham. Suspected killers of Craig Rideout killed the four. News 10 NBC is breaking this story. Murder suspect Paul Tucci is the focus of another investigation. Chief investigative reporter Berkeley Breen has learned exclusively that an expert is re-examining how Tucci's wife died back in 2014. Investigators also wondered about Paul's wife, Jennifer, who had passed away from liver disease, and the timing of her death. They found that it was possible to poison someone slowly and have it look like cirrhosis of the liver. They asked for her case to be reopened and said without a doubt they now had questions about whether Paul could be involved. But the district attorney did not pursue this, and the medical examiner said he was happy with the first examination. Colin also gave an interview saying he was set up to take the fall, directing much of his anger towards Laura. The thing that angered me the most was her unwillingness to take any kind of responsibility, because whenever I would talk to her, she would be, "I'm sorry, this is happening." It's like, no, this isn't just happening. She did this. She set me up for murder. Ask anyone who knows me. I'm not an impetuous person. I don't do things impulsively or on a whim, but that murder was premeditated. It was deliberate. It was calculated, he said. He claimed his only involvement was cleaning up the blood, but that he was unaware of what had happened, and thought maybe at the worst there had been an accident. There is even a free call and Rideout page. But when his mom Laura filed her appeal, she blamed her sons for everything. Her attorney said, "This is not the plan of a reasonable, intelligent adult. This is more indicative of impetuous violence by sons who thought they were helping their siblings escape an abusive father, followed by a slapdash attempt to cover up their crime." Laura's appeal was denied. Alex Rideout, who was convicted in connection to his father's murder, has been released from prison. Alex Rideout, who was not convicted of murder, was soon freed. Craig and Laura's youngest children went to live with other family members in the Midwest. Julia graduated high school, Elizabeth started college, and Andrew started serving in the United States Marine Corps. This case is the definition of senseless, heartless, and with everyone continuing to point the finger at each other, it makes you ask more questions than you'll ever get answers to, and leaves a family irreparably broken. Craig's mom Agnes said she still talks to Andrew, but everything else is just too fractured. So much has happened. Robin agreed and said, "It is still beyond my comprehension that they thought this was the only way out. The ends didn't justify the means." By all accounts, Craig was a family man through and through. Everything he did was for his family. And how tragic, that is when you think about the nature of his death. He gave a lot in his time to his community, always conducting himself with dignity, grace, and leading with kindness. Robin and her family strive to continue to carry themselves in the same way. She said, "There's nothing to be done to bring my brother back. My hope is that he will be remembered as the kind, loving man he was." Story 4. Today's case takes us to Northeast Phoenix, Arizona in the United States. The 16th of January, 1997. As Scott Follier stood at the top of his stairs in his home, the police shouted at him to get on the ground. He appeared to be confused. Why were they in his house, he asked them. They repeated their instructions to keep his hands where they could see them and to get on the ground. He was asked if there was anyone else there, and Scott said there was him, his wife, and their 2 children. The officer thought that was a strange response considering what he had found in the backyard. Their next concern was checking on the children, aged 12 and 15. They were safe and in their beds, unaware of the nightmare that was unfolding. "I went to bed as a 12-year-old kid with a happy life, and I woke up to a police officer telling me that my mother died." Scott Follier was the eldest of 5 children born into a middle-class Catholic family. He was described as quite introverted and also studious. During his childhood, he would witness violence in his parents' marriage, with his mother Lois saying it wasn't pretty, not by any means. It really got to Scott as the oldest. In an English class at Brookfield High School, Scott would meet his future wife, Yamala. Yamala thought it was cute that he had a habit of dozing off during class. She was intelligent and lively, popular but quiet with a flair for the arts. After high school, they went to colleges 50 miles away from one another in Illinois. They stayed in touch, and later the romance reignited, and they became engaged. It was during this time that, after speaking to Mormon missionaries, Scott converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Yamila had, like Scott, been born into a Catholic family, but she wasn't as enthusiastic about the conversion, at one point even threatening to end their engagement. This didn't happen, and the pair married in 1976 in a civil ceremony, presided over by a Mormon bishop. After marrying, she wanted very little to do with Mormonism. When his church friends came over, she would leave the room or the house altogether. During a visit to Salt Lake City, they went to the Latter-day Saint temple there and heard a talk about eternal matrimony, the idea that you're not just married in this life, but for eternity. Following this, Yamila began to go to religious classes and was later baptized as a Latter-day Saint. She got a job in a medical lab, and Scott worked in electrical engineering. The couple then moved to Florida, where they welcomed 2 children. Megan, born in June 1981, and her little brother Michael, followed 3 years later. They then moved to Minnesota before settling in Phoenix, Arizona in 1987. After their second baby was born, Yamila quit her medical job, but she began to feel controlled and stuck. By Scott's own admission, he was self-centered and arrogant, and she was left without a support system, leaving her incredibly depressed in Minnesota. After moving to Phoenix, Scott began working for Motorola, which consisted of long hours and stressful meetings. In his spare time, he was also a family and personal counselor and a teacher at their church. Yamila would also go back to work as an assistant at a preschool. In 1997, the family had an exciting trip in Europe planned for the summer, and Scott wanted to pursue his goal of becoming a science and mathematics teacher. Yamila was described by Scott as a great wife and mother. He also said she was his best friend. Michael, the couple's son, called his upbringing a happy one, saying he came from a loving home. The 16th of January, 1997. Scott said that at around 3 in the morning, he and his wife had awoken to a strange sound. It sounded like someone was walking around on the gravel outside of the bedroom window. Scott went to the window and looked out, but couldn't see anything that caught his eye. He said he barely slept the night. As morning rolled around, he went to work as usual. He was stressed at work as it was looking more and more likely that the project he had been working on and in charge of was going to be canceled, meaning there would be several job losses. That day, he had an argument with his boss during a meeting and was due another meeting with his team the following day. It wasn't looking good. He went home for the evening at around 7 p.m. After the family meal, Scott went to prep for the religious education class that he taught the next morning at around 6:15 a.m. Yamila spoke to Scott and asked him to have a look at and fix the pool pump in the garden, and at about 9 p.m. he went outside to have a look. Due to the lack of light, he soon gave up and headed back inside. He put the flashlight, screwdriver, and pliers into the back of the Volvo in the garage. His wife had fallen asleep on the sofa, so he gave her a kiss goodnight and went to bed. "I was really exhausted and crashed in bed," he said. "I would guess it was between 9:30 and 10 p.m. Greg Coons was a neighbor of the Falia family. His then-girlfriend Stephanie Reed Head was with him on that night in January, and the couple were heading to bed. There was a noise outside. It was a moaning or a crying sound. Stephanie heard a woman saying, "Please no," or "Please don't" several times. Greg went to have a look to see if he could work out what was going on. He looked over the wall and into his neighbor's garden and saw something horrible. A woman was lying on the ground. He initially thought that maybe she'd had too much to drink. She was a few feet from the pool lying on her side. She rolled onto her back and then stopped moving. Then a light came on upstairs in the house. Greg saw Scott in the upstairs room and watched him for a couple of minutes. He was wringing his hands in the sink. The light then went off. Greg observed as Scott went into the kitchen and then the living room. He then came out of the side garage door wearing a white shirt and red sweatpants and motioned for one of the dogs to lie down. He stood over his wife for a couple of minutes before going back inside. After 3 or 4 minutes, Scott came back out. He was wearing a glove and putting the other one on. Scott appeared to be looking in Greg's direction, so he kept his head down while he continued to observe. Scott dragged his wife over to the pool, rolled her in, and held her underwater. Greg shot back inside, and at 10:57 called the police. "This looks like he told her to go underwater." "I'm sorry, can you talk with the officers? There's a male next door to his wife in the pool, and now he's holding her down underwater." The police had never received a call or report relating to this address before. Officers from the Phoenix Police Department were immediately deployed, and officers Joel Tranner, Kent Bladen, and Stephen Stanowitz were soon on scene. The officers needed to take extreme caution, as they had no idea what they were walking into. In the pool they found Yamila's body floating surrounded by blood. Stephen immediately pulled her out, but he knew that there was nothing they could do. 41-year-old Yamila was gone. I've never seen a shark attack in person, but to me it was reminiscent of a shark attack, Joel said. Joel and Kemp then noticed something. Someone was moving around in the upstairs of the house. Stephen stayed with Yamila, and Kemp drew his gun and ran into the property. As Scott came downstairs, he was told to keep his hands where they could see them and to get on the ground. Another officer, Joseph Jones, saw blood behind Scott's right ear and on his tricep. His report said as he spoke to me, he seemed very shaky with shortness of breath. He also had difficulty breathing. Scott was taken into custody and loaded into the police car. He later said that he sat in the car outside the house for over an hour and overheard the officers talking about his wife. It was obvious that she had either been badly hurt or killed. The officers then woke up the Failure children and broke the news to them. Their mother had died. Scott was driven to the station to be interviewed. 1:53 a.m. January 17, 1997. Obviously you think I did it. I don't know what makes you think that, well, because I had a neighbor staring at you watching you do it. That's why. Waiting for Scott at the station was homicide detective John Norman, who soon began the interrogation. Scott was adamant that he couldn't remember anything. He said the first thing he could remember of that night was an officer shouting at him to keep his hands in the air. He said he was stood at the top of the stairs in his pajamas. Neighbors saw me pushing her in the pool. You've got to be kidding. I'm sorry, I don't remember doing it. There was no blood on his top or bottoms, so John asked him why was there blood on his neck. Scott said he didn't know. He also had a bandage on his finger. He said he didn't know how that got there. John said that they had found Yamala with stab wounds in the pool, and his neighbor had seen him push her underwater. Scott appeared to be shocked, but John didn't believe it. His story was hogwash. The only thing I believed about his story was that his name was Scott Failure, he later said. A search was conducted of the property, and a flashlight was found shining towards the pool pump. There was absolutely blood everywhere. On the stairs inside the house, they found a stone covered in blood, a stone that resembled one of the decorative pebbles from around the pool. There was more to be found in the garage. Hanging out of the back of the family Volvo was a shirt stained with blood. Inside the trunk, there was a plastic container filled with bloody jeans, an undershirt, and socks. There was also a hunting knife covered in blood. A black plastic bag was next to the box, and that contained brown boots and black leather gloves, both of which were also heavily soaked in blood. Yamala Failure had many shocking injuries. There were 44 stab wounds, 12 defensive wounds to the hands, 2 behind her left ear, 3 to the stomach, 6 to the back, 10 to the chest, and 11 to the neck. 5 of the wounds were 4 inches deep. 1 of the stab wounds had wounded her heart, and 3 of them had pierced her lungs. She also had water in her lungs. The day after the killing, the 2 children were interviewed. They said they could think of nothing unusual about that evening, nor anything that could have led to this. There had been no dispute or argument. Their mother had been reading a book and watching television when they went to bed at 9:30 p.m. Scott Failure was charged with first-degree murder. He was adamant. He didn't know what had happened. The plan had originally been for Scott to plead guilty by reason of insanity. But this would soon change. When Scott's lawyer interviewed Greg Coons in the presence of Lois, Scott's mother, in the lead-up to the trial, it was reported that his story had changed slightly. Lois later said, "I remember him talking about Scott's movements being calm and deliberate, and that he had a flat expression like a robot. That's exactly what he said. He also said he thought Scott may have seen him, but that Scott never said a word." After hearing this, Lois told Scott's lawyer that Scott had a history of sleepwalking. It would normally happen when he was stressed. This would now be his new defense. He had killed his wife while sleepwalking. This defense had been used in less than 30 murder trials across the world at that point, but it had been successful. In Toronto, a man was acquitted of attacking his father-in-law and killing his mother-in-law after driving there and launching an attack, as it was determined he had been in a state of sleepwalking. This would mean that for their defense of sleepwalking to work, the jury would need to be convinced that Scott had murdered his wife, held her underwater, made at least 2 trips to the car to put his clothes and murder weapon in the back, recognized the dog, not seen the dog as a threat, and motioned for the dog to lie down. Well, what do you think of this as a defense strategy for killing a spouse? An Arizona man set out to convince a jury that he stabbed his wife 44 times while sleepwalking. When looking at his history of sleepwalking, Lois would say there were several times he came down the stairs fully dressed and walked into the living room, and he was all ready for school, and it was like midnight. Then one time he came down the stairs, and he was probably 15 or 16, and he was stark naked. The next day you'd ask him about it or talk to him about it, and he had absolutely no idea that this happened. His sister Laura described an incident from when Scott was 20. He was sleepwalking and going towards the back door. And when she tried to stop him, she said he grabbed me by my shoulders and just tossed me. He looked just so angry, he looked almost demonic. I've never seen him look like that, never. Scott was adamant he didn't remember these incidents. Richard Boot's son, an expert in sleep disorders, said that displays of violence during an episode of sleepwalking are very rare, but there were instances of it happening. Initially, even Scott wasn't convinced by his own defense. I didn't question him, my attorney, or push him hard at the time. But inside I just felt it was a bunch of BS. It was very simple and pure BS, and it had no basis in reality. This sounds to me like a Twinkie defense. I thought my brain had thrown a rod, and I thought I'm going to the state hospital or to the prison for life. That was before I even knew that you can take drugs that change your sleeping patterns at night. At that point, I was saying I'd accept a lifetime probation of living alone, let my kids sleep somewhere else, lock me up on my own because I don't want to hurt somebody else, he added. Sometimes when I think about this, I wonder what kind of Jekyll and Hyde am I. There's no way I could hurt Yarm. I didn't know that something like that could be in anybody I've ever known, much less me. If he had been sleepwalking, why had he got the knife? His sister Laura speculated that he had been trying to cut the broken pool pump and fix it. When we looked at the pump a week or so after Yarm died, it was freshly gouged, she said. He said that he had used the hunting knife while sleepwalking to fix the pump instead of the screwdriver. It was argued that when Yarmala had tried to stop him, he had attacked her. He would sleep for only 3 hours a night for several days in a row. Then he would crash and try and sleep for 9 hours. For this defense to be successful, it would have meant he needed to fall asleep quickly that night. Scott said he did. That was one of my crash nights. I just hit the bed and must have gone right out cold, he said. Before his trial, he was interviewed by Dr. Janet Tapman, a psychologist. He spoke of several incidents of sleepwalking between the ages of 10 and 13 that his mother had told him about. He said that during his marriage there had been times that he had woken up on the sofa in the living room or on the floor by the bed with no recollection of how he came to be there. He recalled an incident where his wife had told him that he had grabbed her arm while he slept, something he didn't think much about until after he was arrested. Scott spent 4 nights in a sleep lab to be monitored to look at the brainwaves of his sleeping patterns. The data showed hypersynchronous delta waves, a symptom that can be associated with those who have episodes of sleepwalking. Prosecutors called on the help of Dr. Mark Pressman to see if there was any evidence that Scott had been sleepwalking on the night Yarmala was killed. He found that the study Scott had been a part of was not that significant, saying that these symptoms could also be found in someone with sleep apnea. Scott said he had gone to bed with his contact lenses in, then got up, dressed himself, grabbed a flashlight, and headed outside. Dr. Pressman said that when one sleepwalks, they aren't able to tell if it's night or day. So him changing and taking the torch suggested he knew it was dark, and he knew it was cold. As he waited to go on trial, Scott Foley gave an interview with 20 to 20. I have to accept that the neighbors saw me do the physical act. Would I have consciously or intentionally killed her? Absolutely not. Also interviewed were the couple's children. After you went to bed at 9 o'clock, what was the next thing you remember? Waking up at around 1:30. Why did you wake up? A police officer came and woke me up. Michael, are you aware of the fact that if your father is convicted of first-degree murder, that the prosecutor could ask for the death penalty? Have you prepared in your mind for that prospect? Not really. June 1999, after pleading not guilty, Scott Faglia went on trial. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It is a high-profile trial that's already received national attention, and it's set to begin in just about an hour. Scott Foglia will go before a jury that will decide whether he should be convicted in the death of his wife. Juan Martinez led the prosecution. He was a prosecutor who had never lost a murder case before. The prosecution was adamant that Scott was conscious and aware when he killed Yarmala. They said that he had murdered his wife, and then attempted to make it look like she had been killed by an unknown person. They believed he had got Yarmila to leave the living room and go out into the backyard with him, and then stabbed her. He then went inside to wash his hands, and put it before going into the garage to hide the knife and the clothes in the Volvo. He went back out, got the dog to be quiet, and noticed that she was still, against all odds, breathing. So he made the decision to drown her, and then go back to bed and leave her to be found in the morning. Scott's lawyer presented their defense. He was sleepwalking at the time the event occurred, and he had no consciousness in his mind operating at that time. In fact, his brain was this was a senseless crime, he said. There is just no reason for Scott Folia to kill the woman he loved more than anything else in the world. The real question was, why did this happen? What went wrong? There was no motive. In short, he was sleepwalking at the time this event occurred. There is no doubt that Scott Folia committed the act, but he had no intention of committing the crime. One of the people to testify during the trial was Dr. Philip Keene, the chief medical examiner. He laid out all of her horrific injuries, and based on this, the prosecution believed he had put his left arm over her mouth to silence her, and then used his right hand to stab her. One of the star witnesses for the prosecution was Greg Coons. He told the court what he had seen that night. Who were the neighbors you used to meet? Scott and Yarmila Folia. And draw your attention back to January 16th of 1997. I saw a person laying on the ground, heading towards the house, beating towards the pool equipment. My impression was that she was drunk. And Mr. Folia appeared through that and walked through my field of view. So what do you see him doing in the kitchen? The next time I see him, he's walking from the kitchen back into the living room, and it looks like he's bringing his hands. Then what happens? He moved her legs around to the side. He knelt down behind her and pushed her into the water. But his defense team hit back and said he was in a sleep-like state when the murders occurred. And this was where the science was going to be key. The experts could not agree on how to interpret the way Scott had behaved that night. Dr. Rosalind Cartwright and Dr. Roger Broughton were two leading sleep experts, and they were brought in by the defense. They testified that they believed he had been in a sleepwalking state when his wife was killed. It's my opinion that he was sleepwalking. He would not leave all the evidence there, would not leave bloody clothes on the back of a car that he was going to drive, would not leave a pool full of blood. To me, none of these make sense. Dr. Cartwright said, sometimes they hurt themselves, sometimes they hurt other people. But this is a state in which they are confused. They are not conscious. They think something terrible is happening, and they have to defend themselves. So often they will fight. The officer who had conducted the search of the house and found the knife and the bloody clothes also testified, and the police argued that this showed he had attempted to wash the blood off himself and hide the items. Dr. Broughton said that carrying out so many different things during an episode of sleepwalking was unusual. How had he not heard his wife? But he had heard and quietened the dog. The defense experts said that they were under the impression that the dog had been jumping up at him, and that was what he was responding to, not the sound of the dog itself. Other sleep experts would also testify that when sleepwalking, one would usually do something familiar or routine, not something out of character or complex. Although it was rare for someone to be violent when sleepwalking, it could happen. The defense also had two of Scott's cellmates testify that they had seen him sleepwalk too. The prosecution questioned Dr. Broughton, who conceded that he hadn't come across a case where a sleepwalker had been violent and changed their clothes several times. The prosecution called a sleep expert who said he believed that Scott must have been awake during the killing because there were too many complicated actions for one person to do while sleepwalking. Dr. Pressman testified in court and listed off 66 different behaviors that were not consistent with someone sleepwalking. He said that Scott touching the water in the pool would have been enough to wake him up. All the evidence says his behaviors were far too complicated to be sleepwalking. In your experience, do sleepwalkers tend to conceal objects? Is that something that they do generally? Sleepwalkers may misplace items, but to my knowledge, sleepwalkers never hide something. And these items were not only hidden, they were packaged neatly. The only way that sleep specialists think that violence can happen with a sleepwalker is that somebody confronts them, physically confronts them, gets in their way. That's clearly impossible on the second episode of Violence. Alongside the bloody clothes and the knife in the container, a mouthpiece had been found, and the prosecution suggested that he may have put it in order to defend himself. DNA tests on the mouthpiece were not definitive. Scott said, "I have no idea what that's about. It's very possible that the thing was laying around in the garage, and I popped it in my mouth, I don't know." One of Yarmila's friends testified that she and Yarmila talked about everything, and she had never expressed issues about her marriage. She did say that Yarmila had told her about an incident when Scott had been going through the wardrobe during the night and appeared to be asleep. This image of a picture-perfect marriage was called into question by the prosecution. They said that Yarmila was not happy being a Mormon, and she didn't want any more children. Scott did. Also, when her body was found, she was not wearing her wedding ring. His defense argued that these were not the major disagreements they were being made out to be, certainly not a good enough reason for him to commit murder. In court, homicide detective John Norman, who had interviewed Scott after his arrest, said that the accused didn't seem to be too upset and didn't cry. But even with all of his experience in the field of homicide investigation, even he was at a loss for a motive. The relationship seemed to be good. There were no allegations of domestic abuse or arguments. They were financially stable. There were no affairs. There was no alcohol abuse or substance misuse. Scott said, "Yarm, and I hadn't even had an argument. We hadn't screamed and shouted at each other in 15 years. I never would have thought of hitting her or striking her or yelling at her." Phoenix Police Sergeant Mike Torres said, "Usually you're able to find a motive. You're able to find out reasons behind an action. But this one has remained a mystery. We don't know, and I don't know that we ever will." Court paperwork said the question of motive remains unanswered. It was now time for the man at the center of this to take the stand. He repeated his story. He had no recollection of what had happened that night. He told the jury that he and his wife were happy and devoted to each other. "There was no way I could do that, not intentionally. I loved her. I don't know what I would do without her," he said. "I assumed that I must have gone crazy or something in my head had broken." This was certainly a complicated trial, which left the jury with much to think about. It was now time for the closing arguments. Sleepwalking is triggered by stress when a person can be under a great deal of stress, and it can also be triggered by sleep deprivation when you're very tired or just worn out. The actions during the episode are often illogical and somewhat nonsensical. The behavior is involuntary without intent. The level of consciousness isn't there. The evidence is also clear that he was alone on set, and he did it without any conscious thought. He did it without awareness because he was sleepwalking. The defense said that all of the experts had been able to testify that there was a connection between murder and sleepwalking, and that Scott should be found not guilty, as he was fast asleep at the time and unaware of what he was doing. The prosecution hit back at this. They said that this was premeditated murder, plain and simple. The prosecutor said that during the incident Scott had recognized his dog and got the dog to lie down. "How come he can't recognize his wife?" he asked. "Because he's making it up." They emphasized all of the complicated actions he had taken that night while allegedly being asleep. He had stabbed his wife, changed his clothes, hidden the clothes, the shoes, the gloves, the murder weapon, pushed her underwater, got the dog to lie down. They said this was not done by someone sleepwalking. This was someone who was well aware of what he was doing. This complicated trial had lasted for a month, and it was now time for the jury to deliberate. There were so many different pieces of evidence and theories to consider, but before long the jury returned their verdict. It was unanimous. The jury, Julian, Pamela, and Soren, in the above entitled action, upon our oaths do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree. It was a terrible death, and we are satisfied that we were able to prove that the defendant committed premeditated murder, the prosecutor said. Members of the jury also spoke about their decision, with one saying that the kind of knife used, a hunting-style knife, was not used for any other purpose except for killing. Another juror said after the trial, "I think he could have been sleepwalking when he stabbed his wife. The possibility exists, but we don't know. There is no witness. But when he dragged the body, I think he woke up. He could have been sleepwalking, woke up, and he saw, 'Oh no, look at this,' and I think he panicked. I never would have thought in my wildest dreams someone would think that I premeditated and planned to murder my wife. I just can't see how they could have come to that determination. So I was not expecting a first-degree guilty verdict. It was now time to determine his sentence. One of the possibilities was the death penalty. During the sentencing, following various character witnesses, the judge ultimately decided against capital punishment. He was especially swayed by Scott's children, who pleaded for their father's life. Yamila's mother also made the same request. Consequently, Scott Falia was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he showed no emotion as he was sentenced. His defense lawyer said that while the sentence was not a surprise, they were planning on appealing. Scott and Yamila's children supported him throughout the trial and sentencing. "He is still my dad, and I hope to always have that relationship with him, whether he's in prison or out," Michael said. It was a murder case that shocked people, in part because it was so gruesome and in part because the killer claimed he was asleep when he committed the crime. Now the man convicted of killing his wife is speaking out from behind bars. I think about what she had to go through that night and the pain and the terror she had to feel. I can't even fathom. I was so, but I believe that she would be willing to be more understanding and forgiving of me than I feel right now about myself. Yes. I just said, what do you say or what do you think of the people who look at you, including those jurors who convicted you? And just say, are you kidding me? There's no way I'm going to buy that. There's no way someone could sleepwalk their way to stabbing someone who they purport to love 44 times and then drown them. He maintains that regardless of how believable it is, it's the truth. What happened on that night in January 1997 has caused much debate and conversation in the years since. Although there are many unknowns about the case, one thing is evident. Just how loved and respected Yamila was, utterly devoted to her family, and an amazing mother. She was someone who gave her heart to those that she cared about. Story 5 Fargo, North Dakota, 2009. Home to 49-year-old Philip Gattuso. His older brother Roy described him as a big softy, always polite and friendly, a great listener, and a very gentle person. He was a well-respected and well-known dentist running his own practice for the last 7 years. His patients loved him and said his calming demeanor and big smile made a sometimes scary visit much easier. After high school, he had gained his biological sciences degree in Louisiana before settling on dentistry. He met and married his first wife, and the couple had 2 sons, Philip Jr. and Joseph. The couple would eventually split, and Philip made the move to Oklahoma City to take some extra courses in the hopes of running his own practice. And it was here that he met a music-loving waitress, Valerie. He asked to take her out on the same day, and fell head over heels for her. They shared a love of jazz, cooking and travel, and married in 2001. By 2003, Philip's career was really on the up, and he had finally achieved his dream of taking over a practice. He and Valerie moved into a condo on South University Drive, and soon welcomed their daughter, Kennedy. Sometime after Valerie became pregnant, however, she started having heart trouble, and after she gave birth, she was scheduled in for surgery to repair a mitral valve. 2 weeks after this photo was taken, and when Kennedy was just 2 years old, Valerie underwent heart surgery, but it resulted in a serious complication. She had to be medically sedated for 2 months, staying in hospital for a total of 9 months, battling organ failure, blood infections, and many strokes. Valerie's family and Philip were fighting about where Valerie should receive her treatment. Her family said Oklahoma City was one of the few places with a doctor that specialized in what she needed, and this was also where her parents lived. But Philip, after lengthy research himself, believed he'd found a local hospital that would provide the best treatment and give her a better chance of getting a heart transplant. After much conversation, Valerie and Kennedy ended up moving in to live with Jean and Sharon in Oklahoma. Phil had been trying to take as much time off to be with her as he could, but with a mortgage and mounting medical bills, along with everything else, he had to carry on working, and Valerie would feel a little safer knowing that there would be people in the house all the time. He was upset about the move and didn't want to be away from Kennedy, but he knew that it would be more comforting for Valerie to have her there. Tragically for everyone, Valerie sadly died. Kennedy came back to live with Philip, and although he was being as strong as he could for his now 3-year-old, friends said he felt like his world had been damaged beyond the point of repair. He said he felt like he had been grieving her loss for a long time already, as he knew deep down she would never fully recover and things could never be the same. But no one could believe she was gone. As heartbroken as he was, he never let Kennedy see his pain. He grieved privately and cried alone, keeping everything as normal as possible for her. It was business as usual, coloring and games before breakfast, work at the practice and dinner and movies for when Kennedy came home. October 26, 2009. At 8:30 a.m., Philip dropped Kennedy off at her daycare and headed back home for a 10:30 a.m. conference call. Now it was just him and his daughter, and with no family nearby. He had started putting things in place to scale back his working hours, and he had scheduled this call to start handing things over. Almost 12 hours later, just after 7 p.m., a good friend of Valerie and Philip's, Julie Willett, got an unexpected phone call from Kennedy's daycare. When Valerie passed away, Julie and her husband really stepped up to help Philip, and she was one of the few people listed as an emergency contact for Kennedy. The daycare said that Kennedy was still waiting for her dad. Philip had not turned up to get her, and they hadn't been able to contact him all afternoon. This had never happened before, and Julie knew something had to be wrong. Worrying he'd fallen at the house and hurt himself, she started phoning around to try and get someone to pick Kennedy up as she and one of Philip's neighbors went to his condo. All the doors and windows were locked, so the neighbor climbed the fence to try and get in through the back door of the garage. Peering inside, he noticed Philip's Porsche was missing. They managed to get the garage door open and get inside. The condo was a total mess. Drawers were open, photo frames and paintings had been knocked off the wall. There was smashed glass and furniture was overturned. It had been totally ransacked, and there was no sign of Philip. It was silent when they called out. It seemed whoever had done this was long gone. Julie tentatively went towards the master bedroom, and it was here that she found her friend. Philip was lying on the floor, his head surrounded by blood. Julie described it as an out-of-body experience, and said she watched herself calling 911, and she can't remember what she did. Soon the police, ambulances, and local media were outside. Kennedy stayed with Julie that night, and she didn't understand what was going on, so the Willets decided to try and make it a fun sleepover. Kennedy asked all night when her dad was coming to get her until finally, at 3 a.m., she fell asleep. Police started calling around Philip's family members with the news, but almost everyone lived out of state and wouldn't be able to get into town for a while. They called Jean and Sharon Kirkpatrick too, Valerie's parents, and they were terribly upset. The detectives said for this to happen so soon after losing their own daughter, it was a nightmare. Kennedy was now without anyone, and Jean and Sharon got ready for the almost 900-mile trip to bring her back to their house. It seemed that robbery was the motive, and then the burglar or burglars realized Philip was in his bedroom. He had tried to fight them off, and they had killed him before stealing almost everything. Including his Porsche, there were missing TVs, laptops, cash, cameras, DVD players. The police said you name it, if it was electronic or worth a decent amount, it was gone. The autopsy showed that Philip had been beaten to death, and the shape of the wounds indicated that the murder weapon was something with a circular impact area, like a hammer. He had been hit on the head at least 10 times, and his skull was so fractured the examiner said it was like broken glass dropped on the floor. Of 12 condos is tucked away off the main drag of South University. It's quiet and almost hard to find. That's part of why people who live here are so shocked that one of their neighbors, kind and soft-spoken, could have been the target of a homicide. We'll treat this as a suspicious death until we can rule out any aspect of this. His 1999 silver Porsche boxed stolen. Detectives determined that he had never made his conference call, so he must have been killed between about 8:45 and 10:30 a.m. Knowing this made them question things even more. It was clearly not only a violent attack, it felt very personal. And ultimately, it was just so risky to do this in broad daylight with everyone coming and going to work and dropping their kids off at school. It was definitely unusual. There were no signs of a forced entry either, no broken windows or damaged locks. So did Philip know his killer? Whoever had done this had been in the house a long time. They were in no rush and took their time clearing everything out. It seemed they knew that they would not be interrupted and that no one else would come home. Jean and Sharon, along with their daughter Reagan, soon arrived to pick Kennedy up. Sharon called Julie and asked her to bring Kennedy to a restaurant to meet them. Julie reminded them that it was the middle of a murder investigation and perhaps they should all stick around for now, so she invited them over for lunch. It seemed they were processing so much that they didn't ask questions and didn't want any answers. The police said the Kirkpatricks were allowed to take Kennedy back with them, and Reagan's family were given temporary custody. But before they left, Valerie's dad Gene spoke to the police. He couldn't think of any enemies that his son-in-law had, or that he had issues with anyone. But he did mention that Philip liked to go to the casino. He was a big poker player, and the only thing that kept him wondering was that Philip might have owed someone money. It would surely explain why so much had been stolen too. I'm not going to use the word gambling. He used to go to, I think, the casino every Saturday. Officers spoke to some of the regulars at the casino, and a lot of them did know Philip. They were shocked to hear about what had happened to him, but were not aware that he owed anyone any money. He was a good player, they laughed. He rarely lost out. It had seemed a really promising lead, but it didn't look like an occasional game of cards held the answer to what had happened to him. With no witnesses in any of the neighboring condos, detectives were hoping that there might be something on a few cameras around the area, and that they would get a hit on Philip's car's number plate. Philip's house was surrounded by lots of shops and restaurants, and the bowling alley just across from his place did offer up some footage. The owner showed them that at 7:30 a.m. a pickup truck with a trailer at the back had pulled in, driven around to face the road, and just parked up. No one got out, and given the fact they didn't open until 11 a.m., it was just a strange time. There were only 3 other cars parked there, but the owner said they were the same each morning. It was just other workers starting their early shift. But this truck had really stood out to him, and he couldn't put his finger on why. 16 minutes later at 7:46 a.m., the truck's lights had flashed and someone got out. They couldn't tell anything about the person, but they were walking in the direction of Philip's condo. Another camera opposite showed someone walking quickly, moving behind buildings as they went, but it was only their legs in frame. At 10:46, what looked like it could be a light Porsche came driving down the road. Philip was already dead by this time, so whoever was driving that car was definitely his killer. It headed into the parking lot of an apartment building, just to the right of the bowling alley. The tow truck then pulled out and drove in the same direction. And at 11:30 a.m., both the truck and the trailer, now towing the Porsche, drove back in the opposite direction. A resident in the apartment building told investigators that at about 11 a.m. that morning she had looked out of her window to see a dark pickup truck and a silver Porsche attached to the trailer on the back. She sheepishly said she was quite a nosy neighbor, and she just had to know what was going on. And thank God she did, the police thought, because this was their first proper lead. This was a very nice car, and the whole scene just looked weird to her. She decided to grab some bags and throw them into the main bins, making an excuse to walk past and snoop. She said the person attaching the car was a middle-aged white male with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled over his face. "Nice car," she commented. "Oh, it's not mine. I'm just moving it for a guy who bought it on eBay," he replied without turning around. She stayed for a moment longer, but it was clear that the man was in no mood to talk. They enhanced the footage, and using her description, the police appealed to the public and were surprised at just how many tips they had got. Video from the nearby businesses would catch glimpses of a black pickup with a U-Haul trailer attached, and a man walking to Gattuso's townhome off South University Drive. One man at a rest stop about 20 minutes away said he recognized the man and the truck instantly. He had been stood by his car and watched as the man in the truck pulled up, but the car on the trailer was covered over. He tried to make some small talk about where he was driving to and the likes, but the man seemed more focused on making sure the car underneath was completely shielded from view. The man, also being a bit nosy, pulled up the top to have a peek. He complimented him on the car, a lovely silver Porsche. The man mumbled something about eBay, and then started heading inside with a plastic bag. The other driver noticed a red stain on his trousers, but at the time thought nothing of it. The cameras inside the rest stop were very good quality, and this confirmed everything he had said almost to the minute. The driver of the pickup truck, and now their prime suspect, walked into the service area to use the toilets, still carrying a black plastic bag. At one point, he looked right in the direction of the camera, and this was the first time they saw his face. About 5 minutes later, the man walked back out, in new jeans and a new t-shirt. The cameras on the outside of the rest stop showed the truck and the Porsche driving away, and this was the first time they could just about make out a license plate. Enhancements showed that it was an Oklahoma license plate and that the truck had been rented. Finally, on October 31st, just 5 days after Philip was killed, the police announced they had made an arrest. The truck had been linked to a Michael Knackfinder. He had a long history with the law, including accusations of rape, kidnapping, home invasions, and armed robbery. He had pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 9 counts of robbery with a firearm in an exchange for a 20-year sentence. He was released on October 24, 2002, having served 8 years of that 20-year sentence. Michael now worked as a handyman, just doing odd jobs around town. The name meant nothing to Philip's family or friends, and there was no connection that anyone could find between Michael and Philip. They lived almost 900 miles apart. Near Michael's home in Oklahoma, officers located a storage unit that he had recently rented. Inside was the stolen Porsche, and inside that was a hammer with Philip's blood and hair on it, and most of the stolen items from the house. Michael sat in custody, saying absolutely nothing. However, after talking to his mother, she revealed the connection. Michael was the handyman of none other than Gene Kirkpatrick, Valerie's father and Philip's father-in-law. Everything was pointing towards a murder-for-hire plot. On November 2nd, the police brought Gene in for an interview. People said Gene had placed blame on Philip for the loss of his daughter and thought once he was out of the picture, they could get full custody of Kennedy. Gene didn't want Kennedy being raised by Philip. But I said, if I do something like this, we won't get away with it. Friends and family could not believe what they were hearing. He did everything he could for his family, and the devastation he felt when Valerie fell ill and eventually passed away had consumed him. In the interview, Gene said he had vented about Philip and admitted he had made comments to Michael about wanting him dead. But he described it as locker room talk, something that Michael had taken seriously without him realizing it. He didn't think his handyman would actually do anything, he said. But later he started to backtrack and admitted to police what they already knew had happened. I guess I gave him the green light. Everything was his suggestion, but I was right there with him. He said he felt awful for considering it, thinking that Kennedy would see him as a monster. She's gonna say my grandfather killed my daddy, he said. At the end of the interview, he asked, am I going to jail right away? It scares me the consequences. Police found that Gene had paid Michael $3,000 in cash to kill Philip, with proof that he had handed this over in a McDonald's parking lot. Gene also promised $10,000 more, and whatever he wanted to steal from Philip's house. Gene sent him a video of Philip's condo in Porsche. Despite how everyone else had described Philip, Reagan said she believed him to be a cold person and a narcissist, saying he couldn't relate to people's feelings. No one in Philip's life recognized what the Kirkpatricks were saying. It just made no sense. Roy said his brother's death was the result of selfishness, revenge, and complete obsession after Valerie had died. Roy said that Gene had made repeated comments pressuring Philip to promise that if Valerie passed away, he would let them have full custody of Kennedy. Philip refused every time, and told his brother that his relationship with the Kirkpatricks had started to deteriorate rapidly. In one conversation with Roy, Philip said he was starting to worry about his own safety after so many threats from Gene. Gene Kirkpatrick was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and Michael Nacklinder was charged with first-degree murder alongside burglary charges. The identification of Mr. Kirkpatrick as a suspect in this case is once again, as I've said in the past, a combination of investigative leads, physical evidence, testimony, all of which led us to believe that Mr. Kirkpatrick had conspired in the death. New information about Gene Kirkpatrick. Eyewitness News 5's Linda Matties has been digging throughout the day. Linda, what have you learned? Jessica, we actually broke the news to the Kirkpatrick's housekeeper that he was in jail, and she says she can't believe that any of this happened. We knocked on the Kirkpatrick's door in eastern Oklahoma City, but no one answered. Investigators say Gene Kirkpatrick hired another Oklahoma City man, Michael Nvidka, to drive to North Dakota and kill his son-in-law, Philip Gattuso. They tell us Kirkpatrick hired the hitman over a family custody battle. He didn't like the way Gattuso was raising his granddaughter ever since her mom passed away. Right after the murder, investigators say the Kirkpatricks drove to North Dakota to pick up the toddler. Gene's wife, Sharon, called their housekeeper on the way. She called me to say they weren't going to be home, because they needed to go north because their son-in-law had an accident. They had to go for their granddaughter. I talked to the housekeeper and her neighbor. They both rent from the Kirkpatrick family, and they say that they are all very nice people. Again, they can't believe that any of this happened. Now coming up tonight at 6, we'll hear from Philip Gattuso's brother, who says that he wants his niece as far away from Oklahoma as possible. One of Gene's old friends said that he was a first-class person who would do anything for you. He called the allegations against him 100% out of character. I have never had anything shock me as much as that did, he said. Michael pleaded not guilty to all the charges, as did Gene. But Gene managed to get a $1 million loan from a friend and bailed himself out while awaiting trial. On November 4th, Philip's funeral was held. Kennedy was not allowed to go, but Philip's first wife, Karen, and her mother, Catherine, attended. They had both stayed close to Philip, and they, along with Philip and Karen's sons, and many more from the community, came together to say goodbye. After a custody battle, a judge ordered Reagan to give up temporary custody of Kennedy so that she could live with Roy, Philip's brother. Roy said he was overwhelmed with joy to have Kennedy in their family home. This afternoon, Michael Nackvinda appeared in a Fargo, North Dakota court to see if the case against him will go to trial. And while there is a chance for a plea bargain, the judge says he does not plan on granting any extensions for the trial. He wants it to start on August 10th. The state's attorney is asking for some additional forensic testing on one item. Sometimes forensic evidence gives you lots of information. Sometimes it gives you inconclusive information, and it depends sometimes on how you have separated the sample. But Nackvinda's attorney does not want the sample tested. He thinks it could be destroyed and hurt his client's case. Obviously, we would like to preserve enough of that sample so that the possibility would exist that we could have some independent testing done. In February, Kirkpatrick posted a $1 million cash bond and is now back in Oklahoma. Both Nakvinda and Kirkpatrick have pled not guilty, and as far as Gene Kirkpatrick, a trial date has not been set for him. Just over a year after that fateful October day, Michael Nakvinda took to the stand in his own defense. This, in the end, turns out not to be that complicated. Find the defendant guilty. They can't put Mike in Fargo at the crime scene. Therefore, the intentional murder charge is unprovable. You're going to have to return a verdict of not guilty. He was denying murder, claiming that he had been framed by Gene, and was under the impression that he was only picking up a car that Gene had purchased on eBay. He started going into detail about velocity, minutes per second, bullets, calibers. And then Gene said, No, I want it done, close up and personal. What did Mike Nakvinda get in return for this friendship and trust? In the end, he got betrayed, and he got framed for a murder he didn't commit. And Gene testified that when they were talking about killing Philip, it was in jest. So anything Michael took from that was out of context. And if he'd killed him, it had only been out of his own volition. More than 30 people testified and 300 pieces of evidence were shown to the court. Michael Nakvinda was finally found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. But first, we have some late-breaking news to tell you about. A North Dakota jury just convicted a Metro grandfather of hiring a hitman to kill his son-in-law. We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, do find the defendant, Gene Carl Kirkpatrick, guilty of the offense of conspiracy to commit murder. In July 2011, a jury also found Gene Kirkpatrick guilty, and he too was sentenced to life in prison without parole. I was very nervous and very scared. But obviously the prosecutors, like I said, did a phenomenal job. Roy Gattuso, Philip's brother, believed all along that Michael Nakvinda was just the weapon. But Gene was the man who really killed his younger brother. We now will have some closure, and also Kennedy will have some closure in the future if she gets older. That's most important to us. Gene, what's your reaction to the verdict? I'm surprised. You're surprised? Yeah. Do you still deny this? Yes. Despite all the letters sent to the judge about how people had got it all wrong about Gene, the judge said he saw through it. Your friends and family do not know the dark side of you, the dark side that the jury saw, the dark side that conspired with Mr. Nakvinda to send him some 900 miles away to this community of Fargo to bludgeon Mr. Gattuso to death, all for your misguided ends. Kennedy was later awarded almost $10 million in damages in a wrongful death lawsuit filed by her family against Gene. And there is now a permanent restraining order that keeps the Kirkpatricks from having any contact with Kennedy. Reagan said she would never try to enter Kennedy's life, but hopes that someday, after Kennedy turns 18, she might look them all up. We'd love to know that she's doing well, and that she's happy, and has had a good life, she said. She visits her father in prison a few times a year, and still believes he's innocent. He does not have what it takes to take someone's life, she said. In 2016, more than 6 years later, a judge ordered that Philip's $3.7 million estate would be divided equally between his sons Joseph and Philip Jr. and Kennedy. Kennedy went to live with Philip's niece in the New Orleans area, and Julie is still close to Philip's family and sees Kennedy every few years as well. She's doing very well. She's turning into a beautiful young lady, Julie said. This weekend marks 10 years since one of the most high-profile, horrific murders this area has ever seen. The murder-for-hire beating death of Fargo dentist Philip Gattuso. It was a crime that shocked everyone in the area, and 3-year-old Kennedy lost both her parents in the space of a year. Friends said that Philip, devastated by the loss of his wife, was more focused than ever on being the best dad he could be. But this was snatched away from him and his 3 children. And for what? It was such a senseless murder that ruined so many lives, and it is a case that will always leave more questions than answers.